The burlap sack over her head couldn't hide the defiance in her stance, as Elias Boone stared at the woman on the auction block. His weathered hands trembling around 10 silver dollars, he had no idea that beneath that rough fabric was a face that would shatter his lonely existence forever. The crowd jeered, calling her damaged goods, but when the auctioneer's hammer fell and Elias led her away, the mountain man who'd sworn off humanity was about to discover that some scars run deeper than skin and some loves burn fiercer than mountain storms. Stay with me, friends, as I tell you this remarkable tale, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and decay through the streets of Cedar Ridge as Elias Boone guided his pack mule between the ramshackle buildings. October had painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and crimson, but here in town, everything seemed gray. The weathered planks of the storefronts, the mud-churned streets, even the faces of the townspeople who hurried past without meeting his eyes. Elias preferred it that way. After 3 years living alone in his mountain cabin, human company had become something to endure rather than enjoy. He came to town only when necessity demanded it, when his flour ran low, when he needed gunpowder for the winter hunts, when his trap repairs required materials he couldn't forge himself. Today was such a day, and he planned to conduct his business quickly and return to the solitude that had become his only comfort since Margaret's death. But as he approached Morrison's general store, an unusual commotion drew his attention. A crowd had gathered in the town square, their voices raised in a mixture of excitement and cruelty that made his skin crawl. Against his better judgment, Elias tied his mule to a post and moved closer, his tall frame allowing him to see over the heads of the assembled townspeople. What he saw made his blood run cold. A makeshift platform had been erected in the center of the square, and upon it stood a woman. But this was no ordinary gathering. This was an auction, and the woman was the merchandise. A rough burlap sack covered her head, hiding her features, but her body language spoke volumes. Despite the rope binding her wrists, despite the jeers of the crowd, she stood straight-backed and proud, her chin lifted beneath the sack as if daring the world to break her. "Now, folks," the auctioneer, a greasy man named Josiah Pratt, called out, with a showman's false cheer, "I know she don't look like much, but she's strong as an ox and twice as stubborn. Previous owner says she's good with cooking and cleaning, though she's got a wild streak that needs breaking. Who'll start the bidding at $5? The crowd laughed ugly, mean-spirited laughter that reminded Elias why he'd chosen the mountains over men. Someone shouted, "Take the sack off. Let's see what we're buying." Pratt shook his head. "Terms of sale, gentlemen. The sack stays on until she's bought and paid for. Previous owner's instructions. Says it's for everyone's benefit." More laughter rippled through the crowd, and Elias felt his jaw clench. $3? Shut, someone called out. $3? Pratt scoffed. "Gentlemen, you pay more than that for a decent saddle. This here's a human being broken in for domestic work. Surely she's worth more than $3? Not if we can't see her face," another voice argued. "Could be hiding anything under there. Poxcar's madness, who knows what." The woman on the platform shifted slightly, her bound hands clenching into fists. Elias found himself studying her more closely. Her dress, though worn and patched, had once been a decent garment. Her boots, visible beneath the hem, were sturdy and well-maintained. This wasn't some vagrant or criminal. This was a woman who'd known better days, reduced to this humiliation by circumstances he could only imagine. $4, a new voice offered. Elias recognized Sam Hutchins, who ran the boarding house on the edge of town. The man had a reputation for working his help hard and paying them little. $4 for Mr. Hutchins, Pratt announced. "Do I hear 5? The woman's shoulders tensed. Even through the sack, Elias could sense her desperation. She turned her head slightly, as if trying to gauge where the voices were coming from, who was bidding on her future. The small movement revealed a grace that contradicted her rough treatment, a dignity that no amount of degradation could entirely suppress. $5, called out Wade Garrett, and Elias's blood chilled further. He knew Garrett by reputation, a drunk who'd buried 2 wives already, both under suspicious circumstances. The man leered at the platform, already imagining his purchase. The woman seemed to sense the danger too. She took a small step backward, only to be pushed forward again by Pratt's assistant, a burly man with arms like tree trunks. $5 from Mr. Garrett. Going once. Elias didn't remember deciding to speak. The words simply escaped him, carried on a wave of disgust and inexplicable protectiveness. $10. Every head in the square turned to stare at him. Elias Boone, the hermit of Thunder Mountain, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words to anyone in town for 3 years, had just doubled the highest bid. Pratt's eyes lit up with greed. $10? Now we're talking gentlemen. Do I hear 12? Garrett spun around, his red-rimmed eyes narrowing as he spotted Elias. What's a mountain rat want with a woman? Thought you'd sworn off civilization, Boone? Elias met his gaze steadily. My business is my own. $12, Garrett spat, turning back to the platform. 15 up, Elias countered immediately. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was becoming interesting real entertainment instead of just casual cruelty. The woman on the platform had gone very still, her head tilted as if listening intently to this battle over her fate. Garrett's face flushed purple. You trying to show me up, hermit? I'm trying to conclude a business transaction, Elias replied calmly, though his heart was hammering. $15 was nearly all the money he'd brought to town saved from a season of trapping. If Garrett bid higher, he'd have to walk away, leaving the woman to a fate he didn't want to imagine. $20, Garrett snarled. The crowd gasped. $20 was a substantial sum, more than most men in Cedar Ridge saw in a month. Elias felt his hopes sink. He had $17 in his pocket, and his credit at Morrison's store might stretch to another $5, but that would leave him with nothing for winter supplies. The woman's head drooped slightly, and in that small gesture, Elias saw defeat. She knew what kind of man Garrett was, everyone did, and she knew what awaited her in his hands. $25, Elias heard himself say, though he had no idea how he'd pay it. Garrett whirled on him, hand moving to the pistol at his hip. You don't have that kind of money, mountain man. I have collateral, Elias said, his voice steady despite the risk he was taking. My rifle. It's a Henry repeater worth $40 new. Pratt's eyes gleamed. A Henry rifle was indeed valuable, the kind of weapon that could make a difference in the harsh Colorado wilderness. Let's see this rifle, Mr. Boone. Elias walked to his mule, aware of every eye following him. His hands were steady as he pulled the rifle from its scabbard, though giving it up felt like cutting off a limb. This rifle had saved his life more times than he could count, had put food on his table through 3 harsh winters. But as he walked back to the platform, he caught a glimpse of the woman's posture, straighter, now hope evident in every line of her body, and knew he couldn't walk away. Here, he said, handing the rifle to Pratt for inspection. The auctioneer examined it with the eye of a man who knew weapons. It's genuine, he announced. Well maintained. I'll accept it as collateral. $25 going once. 30, Garrett growled, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. He was pushing beyond what he could easily afford. Elias closed his eyes briefly. He had one more thing of value, one last card to play. $35, he said, and I'll throw in my mule. The crowd erupted in surprised chatter. A man's mule was his lifeline in the mountains, essential for hauling supplies and game. Without it, Elias would have to carry everything on his own back, turning what was now a day's journey to town into a grueling 2-day ordeal. Garrett stared at him, calculation replacing anger in his bloodshot eyes. You're crazy, Boone. No woman's worth your rifle and your mule. Then don't bid against me, Elias replied simply. For a long moment the square was silent except for the wind rattling through the autumn leaves. The woman on the platform stood perfectly still, but Elias could feel her attention fixed on him with an intensity that penetrated even the burlap sack. Finally, Garrett spat in the dirt. She's all yours, hermit. Hope she's worth freezing to death this winter. He stalked away, shouldering roughly through the crowd. Sold, Pratt announced quickly before Elias could change his mind. To Mr. Elias Boone for $35 to be paid in currency and goods as specified. The crowd began to disperse the show over, but not before several men clapped Elias on the shoulder and made jokes about mountain men and their appetites. He ignored them all, focused on the business of transferring his rifle and mule to Pratt's possession and signing the papers that made the woman his legal responsibility. She's all yours, Pratt said, handing over a different set of papers, ownership documents that made Elias's stomach turn. No human should own another yet. Here he was participating in this grotesque commerce. Want me to take the sack off here, or you taking her as is? As is, Elias said quietly. Whatever was under that sack, whoever she was, she deserved to reveal herself in privacy, not as a spectacle for the town's amusement. He climbed onto the platform and approached the woman slowly, as he might approach a wounded animal. I'm going to untie your hands, he said softly. But leave the sack for now. We're going to walk out of here together. Can you do that? She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. Elias cut the rope binding her wrists with his knife, noting how raw and chafed they were. She'd been bound for some time, fighting against her restraints. As soon as her hands were free, she rubbed them together, restoring circulation with practiced efficiency. Follow me, he said, and turned toward the platform's edge. He jumped down first, then turned to help her. She ignored his outstretched hand, gathering her skirts and jumping down herself with surprising agility. Even blinded by the sack, she moved with confidence, suggesting she could see at least a little through the loose weave of the burlap. They walked through the town in silence, Elias acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. The woman matched his pace without difficulty, her head high despite the sack, her stride purposeful. Only once did she stumble when a loose board in the sidewalk caught her foot, and even then she recovered quickly, refusing his steadying hand. The problem of transportation loomed as they reached the edge of town. With his mule now Pratt's property, they faced a long walk to Elias's cabin, 15 miles of rough mountain trail. He'd have to carry what supplies he'd managed to purchase before the auction, and she was hardly dressed for such a journey. We have a long walk ahead, he told her. My cabin's up on Thunder Mountain. It'll take us most of the day, maybe into the evening. She nodded again, that same decisive movement. I can remove the sack now, he offered. We're past the town limits. She shook her head violently, then pointed at the mountain trail ahead, indicating she wanted to wait until they were truly away from any possibility of observers. Elias respected her choice. He shouldered his pack of supplies, meager now, with so much of his money gone, and started up the trail. She followed without complaint, though he could hear her breathing growing labored as they climbed. Her boots, he noticed, though sturdy, were not made for mountain hiking. By the time they were an hour out of town, he could see her beginning to limp. We'll rest here, he announced, stopping at a fallen log beside the trail. She sat gratefully, her hands going to her feet. Through the rough weave of the sack, he heard her suppress a gasp of pain. Your feet are blistering, he observed. She nodded, then made a dismissive gesture she could continue. No, he said firmly. We're still 10 miles from my cabin. If your feet give out, we'll be stuck on the mountain overnight, and you're not dressed for the cold up here. He dug through his pack and pulled out a pair of thick wool socks he'd purchased for himself. Put these on over your stockings. They'll cushion your feet. She hesitated, and he could feel her pride warring with practicality. Finally, she took the socks, turning away from him as she worked them on under her skirts. When she stood again, he could see the relief in her posture. They continued climbing the trail, growing steeper and more treacherous as they gained altitude. The autumn sun climbed toward its zenith, providing welcome warmth, but Elias knew it would set early behind the western peaks. They needed to reach the cabin before dark. As they walked, he found himself studying his mysterious companion. Despite the sack, despite her obvious exhaustion and pain, she never complained, never asked for help. When they had to cross a swift-running creek, she hiked up her skirts and waded through without hesitation, though the water must have been shockingly cold. When the trail became a scramble over loose rocks, she climbed with determination, if not skill, accepting his hand only when absolutely necessary. You're not from around here, he said at one point, not really expecting a response. Mountain-born folk move differently on these trails. She tilted her head, and he could almost feel her considering whether to respond. Finally, she held up 3 fingers, then pointed east. 3 years from the east, he guessed. She nodded. That's about when I came up here myself, he said, surprised to find himself talking. He rarely spoke to anyone about his past, but something about her silent presence made the words come easier. After my wife died. Couldn't stand the civilization anymore, all those people with their sympathy and their suggestions for moving on. The mountain doesn't care about your grief. It just demands you survive. She stopped walking and turned toward him. Even through the sack, he could feel the intensity of her gaze. Slowly, she reached out and touched his arm, a brief, gentle contact that somehow conveyed more understanding than any words could have. They reached a ridge as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Elias's cabin was visible now, nestled in a meadow. Another mile ahead, smoke still trickling from the chimney where he'd banked the fire that morning. "There," he said, pointing. "That's home, such as it is." She stood beside him, taking in the view. The cabin was small but solidly built, with a steep roof to shed snow and thick log walls chinked with mud and moss. A small shed stood nearby for storage, and a creek ran past the clearing, providing fresh water. The meadow around it was golden with autumn grass, and the surrounding forest provided both shelter and firewood. For the first time since they'd left town, she made a sound, a small sigh that might have been relief or appreciation or simple exhaustion. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you inside and get that thing off your head." The final mile seemed the longest, both of them stumbling with fatigue by the time they reached the cabin door. Elias pushed it open, grateful he'd never bothered with Locks, who would climb all the way up here to steal from him. The interior was simple but clean. A single room with a stone fireplace, a rough table, and 2 chairs. He'd built himself a bed in one corner and his few possessions arranged on shelves along the walls. It smelled of wood smoke and leather coffee and the herbs he'd hung from the rafters to dry. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "I'll get the fire going properly." She sank into the chair with obvious relief, her hands going immediately to the sack over her head, then stopping as if afraid to remove it even now. Elias busied himself with the fire, adding wood to the banked coals, until flames leaped up, casting warm light through the cabin. Only then did he turn back to her. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "No one climbs this mountain without good reason, and I'll hear them coming long before they arrive. You can take that off whenever you're ready." Her hands trembled as they rose to the rope tied around her neck, holding the sack in place. She struggled with the knot, her fingers clumsy with exhaustion and possibly fear. "Let me," Elias offered, moving closer slowly. She nodded, dropping her hands to her lap where they clenched and unclenched repeatedly. His fingers were gentle as they worked at the knot which had been tied cruelly tight. When it finally came free, he stepped back, giving her space. "In your own time," he said. She sat for a moment longer, gathering courage, or simply savoring the moment before revelation. Then in one swift movement, she pulled the sack from her head. Elias couldn't suppress his sharp intake of breath. The woman who emerged from the burlap was not conventionally beautiful, but she was striking in a way that made conventional beauty seem insipid. Her face bore the marks of hardship. A scar ran from her left temple to her jaw, pale against her sun-weathered skin. Her nose had been broken at some point and hadn't set quite straight. But it was her eyes that held him, one brown, one green, both blazing with an intensity that spoke of intelligence, determination, and a wildness that no amount of civilization could fully tame. Her hair, dark auburn, shot through with premature strands of silver, had been roughly cut at some point and hung unevenly around her face. As he watched, she ran her fingers through it, trying to restore some order after hours under the sack. "My name is Mara," she said, and her voice was hoarse from disuse, but carried an educated accent that confirmed his suspicion about her origins. "Mara Keene. And I suppose I should thank you, though I'm not entirely sure whether you've saved me or simply postponed my damnation." "Elias Boone," he replied, still struggling to reconcile the fierce creature before him with the broken woman he'd expected to find beneath the sack. "And I suppose that remains to be seen." She laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no real mirth. "Honest. I appreciate that. The man who sold me Garrett Walsh, different from the Garrett bidding today, said I was too honest for my own good, among other things." "Walsh," Elias repeated, recognizing the name. "Owns the Double Bar Ranch down in the valley." "Owned me too for the past 6 months," Mara said, her chin lifting defiantly. "Bought my indenture contract when I came west. Promised decent work and fair treatment. Delivered neither." "Why did he sell you?" Elias asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. A woman who looked like Mara with spirit like hers would have been a challenge to a man like Walsh's authority. "Because I wouldn't break," she said simply. "And because I wouldn't—" She trailed off, her jaw clenching. Let's just say I didn't fulfill all the duties he expected of his female servants. Elias felt anger rise in his chest, hot and familiar. It was the same rage he'd felt watching Margaret waste away from fever while the town doctor refused to climb the mountain in bad weather. The same fury at the casual cruelty of men who saw others as possessions rather than people. He put the sack on you, he said. It wasn't a question. Said no one would buy me if they saw my face first, Mara confirmed. Said I was damaged goods inside and out. The scar, the eyes, he called them witch eyes, and my refusal to submit quietly. He was probably right. The crowd was disgusted enough even without seeing me. You're not damaged, Elias said firmly. She looked at him with those remarkable eyes studying him as if trying to determine whether he was lying or merely naive. You gave up your rifle and your mule for a woman in a sack. Some would say that makes you the damaged one. Some would be right, he admitted, but not about that choice. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Mara spoke again. What happens now? I saw the papers change hands. You own my indenture contract. Elias stood and walked to his pack, pulling out the documents Pratt had given him. Without looking at them, he tossed them into the fire. The papers caught immediately, curling into black ash. Mara gasped. Those papers cost you $35? $35 I paid to get you away from that crowd and from men like Garrett and Walsh, Elias said. Not to own you. No one owns you, Mara Keene. You're free to leave whenever you choose. Leave. She looked around the cabin, then out the window at the darkening mountain wilderness. And go where I have no money, no family out here, no references for work. Walsh made sure of that. He spread word that I'm difficult, possibly mad, certainly dangerous. No one in the valley will hire me. Then stay, Elias said simply. I could use help around here and you need shelter and time to figure out your next move. We can work out fair wages once I get back on my feet financially. You just gave away everything of value you owned for a stranger, Mara pointed out. How do you plan to get back on your feet? Trapping season starts soon. I have Trapp's knowledge of the mountain, and now I have help. You may not know mountains yet, but you're strong and clever. I saw that on the trail. You can learn. She considered this, her fingers absently tracing the scar on her face. And if Walsh comes looking for me, he's not the type to let property go easily, papers or no papers. Then he'll find out why I lived through 3 winters up here alone, Elias said quietly. I may have given up my rifle, but I'm far from defenseless. Something in his tone must have convinced her because she relaxed slightly, the tension that had held her rigid since removing the sack finally easing. I should tell you, she said slowly. Walsh was partly right about one thing. I am dangerous in my way. I don't submit easily to authority. I speak my mind when I should stay silent, and I have a temper that's gotten me into trouble more than once. That's how I got this. She touched the scar again. From Walsh. From his foreman when I refused his advances. Walsh said I was lucky it wasn't worse, that I should be grateful he didn't let the man finish what he started. Elias's hands clenched into fists. Where is this foreman now? Dead, Mara said flatly. Kicked in the head by a horse the next week. Strangest thing, that horse had always been gentle as a lamb before. Walsh blamed me, said I'd cursed the animal somehow. That's when he decided to sell me. Despite the grim subject, Elias found himself almost smiling. Remind me not to make you angry around the livestock. I had nothing to do with it, Mara protested, but there was a glint in her mismatched eyes that suggested she wasn't entirely unhappy about the foreman's fate. Of course not, Elias agreed solemnly. Horses are unpredictable creatures. For the first time since removing the sack, Mara truly smiled. It transformed her face, making the scar seem like an accent rather than a disfigurement, turning her unusual features into something uniquely beautiful. You're a strange man, Elias Boone, she said. Most people are afraid of me once they know my history. Most people haven't spent 3 years alone on a mountain talking to themselves in the wind, he replied. I've probably gone a bit strange myself. Then we'll be strange together, she said and extended her hand. Partners. He took her hand, noting the calluses from hard work, the strength in her grip. Partners. As they shook hands, a sound from outside made them both freeze horses. Multiple horses climbing the trail toward the cabin. Mara's face went pale. Walsh. He must have heard about the sale. Elias moved to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. 3 riders were approaching, and even in the dim light he could make out the bulk of Garrett Walsh in the lead. "Get behind the bed," Elias instructed, pulling his hunting knife from his belt. "Whatever happens, stay hidden." "I'm not hiding while you face them alone," Mara protested. "You're not hiding," he corrected. "You're being strategic. There's an old pistol under the bed wrapped in oilcloth. Get it ready, but don't show yourself unless things go bad." She nodded and moved to the bed, her movements quick and silent. Elias heard her unwrapping the pistol as he opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the small porch. "That's far enough, Walsh," he called when the riders were still 20 yards away. Walsh reined in his horse, his 2 companions flanking him. Elias recognized them as double-bar ranch hands, tough men who wouldn't hesitate to follow their boss's orders, legal or not. "Boone?" Walsh said, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Heard you bought something that belongs to me." "Heard wrong," Elias replied calmly. "I bought a woman's freedom. The papers were legal, the sale was public. She doesn't belong to you anymore." "Those papers were for her indenture contract," Walsh argued. "A contract I paid good money for. She still owes me 6 months of service." "Then take it up with Pratt. He ran the auction." Walsh's face darkened. "Don't play games with me, hermit. That woman is dangerous. She's got unnatural ways about her, probably cursed. You don't know what you've brought into your home." "I know exactly what I've done," Elias said. "I've given shelter to someone who needed it. Nothing more, nothing less." "She tell you what she did to my foreman?" "She told me your foreman attacked her and got what he deserved from a horse with more sense than he had." One of Walsh's men snickered, then quickly fell silent at his boss's glare. "I'm willing to be reasonable," Walsh said, shifting tactics. "I'll reimburse you the $35 and take her off your hands. You can even keep your rifle and mule. I'll work that out with Pratt." "Not interested." $50? Walsh offered. "That's $15 profit for a day's trouble." "Not interested," Elias repeated. Walsh's hand moved toward his gun. "I'm trying to be civilized about this Boone, but one way or another that woman is coming with me." "No," said a clear voice from behind Elias. "She's not." Mara stepped out of the cabin, the old pistol held steady in her hands, aimed directly at Walsh. In the dying light, with her unusual eyes gleaming and her scar standing out pale against her skin, she looked like something out of a frontier legend, dangerous and beautiful in equal measure. Walsh's horse shied nervously, and he had to fight to control it. "You," he snarled. "I should have known you'd corrupt anyone fool enough to help you." "The only corruption here is yours, Walsh," Mara said, her voice carrying surprising authority. "Tell them about my sister." Elias saw Walsh stiffen. This was new information, something Mara hadn't mentioned. "I don't know what you're talking about," Walsh said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Eliza," Mara said, and the name came out like a prayer and a curse combined. 15 years old. You bought her contract the same time you bought mine, promised we could work together. Then you sent me to the main house and her to the quarters near the mine. I haven't seen her in 4 months. "She's working off her debt, same as you were supposed to," Walsh said defensively. "She's a child." Mara's voice cracked with emotion. "And you've got her doing dangerous work in those mines, if she's even still alive." "She's alive," Walsh said. "And she'll stay that way as long as you come back quietly." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Elias felt the situation balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip toward violence at the slightest provocation. "You're threatening to harm a child if Mara doesn't return to your service." Elias said, his voice deadly quiet. "Is that what I'm hearing?" Walsh realized his mistake. Threatening women and children didn't play well even on the frontier where law was sparse. His own men were shifting uncomfortably in their saddles. "I'm saying the girl needs looking after." Walsh backpedaled. "These mountains are dangerous. Accidents happen." "Yes," Elias agreed, taking a step forward. "They do, like your foreman's accident, and like the accident that might befall 3 men who rode onto private property after dark making threats." "You're one man with a knife against 3 armed riders," Walsh pointed out. "One man who knows every rock tree and shadow on this mountain," Elias corrected. One man who's survived 3 winters up here fighting off wolves, bears, and claim jumpers. And I'm not alone. He gestured to Mara, who hadn't wavered in her aim. That old pistol probably doesn't even fire, one of Walsh's men said nervously. Want to bet your life on that? Mara asked sweetly. The standoff stretched taut, each side waiting for the other to make the first move. Finally, Walsh yanked his horse's head around. This isn't over, he warned. The law's on my side. I have legal contracts. Then use them, Elias suggested. Get the sheriff, bring him up here with the proper papers. We'll discuss it like civilized people in the light of day. Walsh spat in the dirt. You've made a powerful enemy today, Boone. Both of you have. You'd best watch your backs. We'll watch each other's, Mara said. That's what partners do. Walsh's face contorted with rage, but he spurred his horse down the trail, his men following hastily. They watched until the riders disappeared into the darkness, then stood in silence for several more minutes, listening to the fading sound of hoofbeats. Only when they were certain the men were gone did Mara lower the pistol. Her hands were shaking now, delayed reaction setting in. Is it true? Elias asked quietly. About your sister. Mara nodded, tears finally spilling over. She's all I have left. Our parents died of fever on the journey west. We sold ourselves into indenture to pay for their burial and to have enough to eat. Walsh promised we'd be together, but he separated us immediately. I tried to find her to get word to her, but he made sure we had no contact. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know if I could trust you yet, she admitted, and because I was afraid if you knew you'd make me go back to save her. We'll get her out, Elias said firmly. I don't know how yet, but we'll find a way. Mara looked at him, those remarkable eyes shimmering with tears and hope. You don't even know me. Why would you risk so much? Elias thought about Margaret, about the life they'd planned that had turned to ash with her death. He thought about 3 years of solitude, of telling himself he preferred the loneliness to the pain of caring again. Because, he said slowly, I've spent 3 years being dead inside. Today, for the first time since I lost my wife, I felt something. When I saw you on that platform, refusing to be broken, despite everything I remembered what it was like to fight for something that mattered. Mara stepped closer, the pistol hanging loose in her hand. Your wife Margaret, you said her name was. Tell me about her. They went back inside and Elias built up the fire while Mara made coffee with the supplies he'd managed to buy before the auction. As they sat at his rough table, he found himself talking about Margaret for the first time in years, how they'd met at a church social, how she'd laughed at his fumbling attempts at courtship, how they'd planned to build a life together in the Colorado Territory. She would have loved it up here, he said, staring into his coffee cup. The wildflowers in spring, the clean air, the silence. But she never got to see it, died of fever 2 weeks after we arrived in Cedar Ridge. I'm sorry, Mara said softly. The doctor wouldn't come. Elias continued, the old anger rising, said it was too dangerous to travel in the storm, but I think he just didn't want to bother for a poor trapper's wife. After she died, I couldn't stand to stay in town, seeing him every day, seeing all the people who'd stood by and done nothing, so I came up here. To hide. To survive, he corrected. It's easier when you only have to worry about yourself. No one to lose, no one to fail. And now, he met her eyes across the table. Now I have a partner, and a sister to rescue. Mara smiled, that transformative expression that made her whole face light up. You realize Walsh won't let this go. He's rich, influential. He can make trouble for us. Let him try, Elias said. I may have given up my rifle, but I've got something better now. What's that? Something to fight for again. They spent the rest of the evening planning, discussing strategies for finding and freeing Eliza. Mara sketched a rough map of the Double Bar Ranch from memory, marking the various buildings and the likely location of the mine quarters where her sister was being held. The problem is the legal contracts, Mara said, frustration evident in her voice. Walsh was smart enough to make everything look legitimate on paper. Even if we could get to Eliza, he could have the law bring her back. Then we need to make the contracts invalid, Elias suggested. Find evidence that he's violated the terms or that they were signed under false pretenses. How? He's careful. Any obvious abuses happen away from witnesses, and the workers are too scared to speak up. Elias thought for a moment. You said there are other indentured servants at the ranch. At least a dozen last I knew. Men and women both, some with children. And they're all being mistreated. Mara nodded. Overworked, underfed, beaten for minor infractions. The mine work is especially dangerous. No proper supports, no safety equipment. But Walsh is careful to make it all look like accidents when someone gets hurt. Then we don't just rescue Eliza, Elias said, a plan beginning to form. We expose the whole operation, get evidence of the abuse testimony from the workers, make it impossible for the authorities to ignore. That's ambitious for a hermit and a witch-eyed troublemaker, Mara said, but there was hope in her voice. Good thing we're both too strange to know it's impossible, Elias replied. As the night deepened, they prepared sleeping arrangements. Elias insisted Mara take the bed while he would sleep on a bedroll by the fire. She protested, but he could see exhaustion weighing on her, the events of the day finally catching up. Tomorrow, we start planning in earnest, he said, as she settled onto the bed. We'll need supplies, information, possibly allies. It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is, Mara replied, her eyes already closing. Elias sat by the fire keeping watch, even though he doubted Walsh would return tonight. As he stared into the flames, he thought about the strange turn his life had taken. This morning he'd been a hermit, heading to town for supplies, content in his solitude. Now he had a partner with mismatched eyes and a dangerous past, a powerful enemy who wouldn't rest until he got what he wanted, and a rescue mission that seemed nearly impossible. And yet for the first time in 3 years he felt truly alive. The mountain had kept him surviving, but Mara had reminded him there was a difference between surviving and living. Tomorrow would bring challenges, danger, possibly death, but it would also bring purpose. A sound from the bed made him turn. Mara was talking in her sleep, her sister's name on her lips. Even unconscious, she was fighting for what mattered. Elias pulled his knife from his belt and began sharpening it against a whetstone, the rhythmic scraping a promise to the night. Walsh thought he'd won by separating the sisters by using one to threaten the other. But he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd given them both something to fight for, and he'd brought them to the attention of a man who'd lost everything once and refused to let it happen to someone else. The first snows would come soon, Elias knew. The mountain would become even more dangerous, more isolated. But that isolation could work in their favor. Walsh was a valley man used to comfort and control. Up here in the thin air and brutal cold, different rules applied. As if sensing his thoughts, Mara stirred and spoke clearly in her sleep. The mountain doesn't care about your money, Walsh. Elias smiled grimly. No, the mountain didn't care about money or influence or legal contracts. It cared about strength, determination, and the will to survive. And in those currencies, he and Mara were wealthier than Walsh could ever be. The fire crackled and sparked, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Outside wind began to rise, bringing with it the scent of coming snow. Somewhere down in the valley, Walsh was probably raging, planning his next move, confident in his power. Let him plan, Elias thought. Up here on Thunder Mountain, strange alliances were forming, and broken people were discovering they were stronger than anyone imagined. The auction block, the sack over Mara's head, the jeering crowd, all of it had led to this moment, this unlikely partnership. Tomorrow they would begin their campaign against Walsh. But tonight, for the first time in years, Elias Boone was not alone in his cabin. The sound of another person breathing, the knowledge that someone else would face whatever came with him, filled the space that had been empty since Margaret's death. He touched the wedding ring he still wore, a habit he'd developed when making important decisions. I think you would have liked her, he whispered to the memory of his wife. She's got your kind of courage, the kind that doesn't know when to quit. The wind howled louder, and Elias added more wood to the fire. Whatever storms were coming, weather or Walsh, they would meet them together. The mountain man who'd bought a rejected bride with a sack on her head had found something he hadn't been looking for, a reason to rejoin the fight. And this time he wouldn't face it alone. The first light of dawn crept through the cabin window, painting golden streaks across the rough wooden floor. Elias had dozed fitfully through the night, jerking awake at every sound, but the mountain had remained quiet except for the usual nocturnal rustlings of small creatures and the whisper of wind through pine boughs. Mara stirred on the bed, sitting up with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. Her mismatched eyes found him immediately, and she relaxed slightly when she saw he was alone and unharmed. You should have woken me for a watch shift, she said, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. You needed the rest more than I did, Elias replied, stretching muscles stiff from sitting all night. Besides, I'm used to keeping watch. Did it for months after Margaret died, convinced the fever would come for me too if I let my guard down. She studied him with those penetrating eyes. Did it come for you? In a way. Not fever of the body, but fever of the mind. Grief can burn just as hot, leave you just as hollowed out. He stood joints protesting. But we have work to do. Walsh won't wait long before his next move. Mara rose and moved to the window, peering out at the meadow, where morning mist clung to the golden grass. He'll go to the sheriff first, try to make this legal. Sheriff Brennan owes him favors, everyone knows it. They'll come with papers, warrants, whatever Walsh can manufacture. How long do we have? 2 days, maybe 3. Brennan doesn't like climbing mountains any more than that doctor you mentioned. He'll take his time, hope we come down on our own. Then we use those days wisely, Elias said, pulling on his coat. First things first, we need supplies. I gave away most of my money yesterday, but I have pelts from last season stored in the shed. They should bring enough to get us through. I can help with that, Mara said, surprising him. I learned to cure hides back east before everything. My father was a tanner. It was a skill Walsh never knew I had, or he would have put me to work on it. They worked through the morning, Mara proving her words true as she expertly evaluated each pelt, separating them by quality and probable value. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, and Elias found himself watching her more than he should, fascinated by the competence she displayed. These beaver pelts are excellent, she said, running her hand along one particularly fine specimen. You could get $15 for this one alone in Denver. Denver's 5 days from here, Elias pointed out. We don't have that kind of time. No, but Thomas Morrison at the general store has a brother in Denver who deals in furs. He might give us Denver prices minus his commission if we offer him exclusive rights to your winter harvest. Elias raised an eyebrow. You learned all that in 6 months at Walsh's ranch. I learned to listen, Mara said with a slight smile. Men talk freely around women they consider broken and harmless. Walsh's business associates would discuss all manner of things while I served their meals, never thinking I might be paying attention. What else did you learn? Her smile faded. That Walsh is in debt. The ranch looks prosperous, but he's leveraged to the hilt. The mine isn't producing what he promised his investors, and he's been cutting corners on safety to try to increase yield. That's why he needs the indentured servants' free labor is the only thing keeping him afloat. Which means he can't afford to lose them, Elias mused, or to have his treatment of them exposed, bad for attracting new investors. Exactly. Mara set aside the last pelt and stood brushing dust from her worn dress. There's something else. One of his investors is a federal judge named Harrison. Walsh has been very careful to keep the judge from seeing the actual conditions at the ranch. Federal judge? Elias's interest sharpened. That's bigger than local law. Much bigger. And Judge Harrison has a daughter, idealistic young woman named Catherine, who's involved with the abolition movement. Even though slavery's been over for 15 years, she's passionate about workers' rights. She visited the ranch once, and Walsh made sure she only saw the main house and the best quarters. But I heard her asking questions, uncomfortable questions about the contracts and working conditions. Could she be an ally? Possibly if we could get evidence to her, but she lives in Denver and her father intercepts most of her correspondence. Walsh made sure of that after her visit. Elias considered this as they loaded the pelts onto a makeshift sledge. Without his mule, they'd have to drag it down the mountain themselves, but it was manageable with 2 people. We need someone else, he said finally. Someone local who might be sympathetic. Any ideas, Mara thought, as they began the descent, the sledge sliding easily on the pine needle-covered trail. There's a woman in town, Rosa Valdez. She cooks at the boarding house. Her husband, Juan, worked at Walsh's mine until he lost his leg in a collapse. Walsh threw them out without compensation, claimed Juan had been careless. Rosa knows the truth, but she's afraid to speak up. They have 3 children. Would she help us? She might if she thought we had a real chance. She loved Juan's sister. She was one of the indentured servants who died in the mine last winter. Walsh called it pneumonia, but Rosa suspected worse. They continued down the mountain, the weight of the sledge requiring both of them to control its descent on the steeper sections. As they worked together, Elias found himself oddly comfortable with the partnership. Mara anticipated needs without being asked, adjusted her grip when the load shifted, and matched his pace perfectly. It was like dancing with a partner who knew all the steps. "Can I ask you something?" Mara said as they paused to rest at the creek crossing. "Ask. Why didn't you remarry? 3 years is a long time to be alone." Elias was quiet for a moment, watching the water rush over the stones. "Fear, I suppose. Fear of losing someone again. It seemed easier to just not try. And now," he looked at her, this fierce woman with her scarred face and extraordinary eyes, "now I'm starting to think the fear of never trying again might be worse than the fear of loss." She held his gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then she turned away, focusing on the sledge. "We should keep moving. I want to be back before dark." The rest of the journey to town passed in companionable silence, both of them alert for any sign of Walsh's men, but the trail remained empty except for a pair of deer that bounded away at their approach. Cedar Ridge looked different to Elias as they entered from the mountain trail. Yesterday, it had been just another necessary evil, a place to buy supplies and escape as quickly as possible. Now he saw it through strategic eyes, noting which buildings provided good cover, which citizens might be allies or enemies where Walsh's influence was strongest. Morrison's general store was busy with afternoon customers, but conversation stopped when Elias and Mara entered. She kept her head high despite the stares and whispers, though Elias noted the way her hand stayed close to the knife he'd given her that morning. Thomas Morrison himself emerged from behind the counter, his expression wary. "Boone, heard you had some excitement yesterday." "I made a purchase," Elias said evenly. "Nothing more exciting than that." Morrison's eyes flicked to Mara, taking in her scar, her unusual eyes the proud set of her shoulders. "Walsh was in here this morning. Said you stole something from him." "Walsh says a lot of things," Mara interjected, her voice calm but carrying an edge. "Doesn't make them true." "No," Morrison agreed slowly. "It doesn't." He seemed to make a decision. "What can I do for you folks?" Elias gestured to the sledge outside. "Prime pelts. Thought you might be interested, especially if your brother in Denver is still buying." Morrison's commercial instincts overtook his caution. He followed them outside and examined the furs with an expert eye, his expression growing more interested with each one. "These are excellent quality," he admitted. "I could go as high as $60 for the lot." "75, Mara countered. "And exclusive rights to Mr. Boone's winter harvest." Morrison looked at her with surprise and a touch of respect. "You know the business." "I know quality when I see it. These pelts are worth $90 in Denver. Your brother takes 20% commission. That leaves $72 profit. You're still making money at 75. The negotiation continued for several minutes, finally settling at $70 cash plus $20 in store credit. As Morrison counted out the bills, he lowered his voice. "Walsh is planning something. He had his men in here buying rope and chains this morning, heavy ones, the kind you'd use for restraining someone." Elias felt Mara tense beside him. "When?" "Don't know, but I'd be careful if I were you. Walsh doesn't like being defied, and he's got the sheriff in his pocket." "We know," Elias said. "Thanks for the warning." They used some of the store credit to purchase ammunition for the old pistol, more food supplies, and surprisingly, Mara insisted on a small mirror and a pair of scissors. "Vanity?" Elias asked quietly. "Strategy," she replied. "If we're going to fight Walsh publicly, I need to look less like a wild woman and more like someone whose testimony might be believed." As they prepared to leave, Rosa Valdez entered the store, a basket on her arm. She stopped short when she saw Mara, her eyes widening with recognition. "Mara Dios mío, we heard you were sold, but—" "I'm free now," Mara said quickly, glancing around to see who might be listening. "Mrs. Valdez, could we speak privately?" Rosa hesitated, fear flickering across her face. Then she straightened, some internal resolve hardening. "Come to my house tonight. After dark. The back door." She gave them directions to a small cottage on the poor side of town, then hurried away. As they left the store, Elias noticed one of Walsh's men lounging against a post across the street, watching them with undisguised interest. The man made no effort to hide his surveillance, even touching his hat mockingly when he saw Elias looking. "We're being followed," Elias murmured. Let them follow away, Mara said loudly enough for the man to hear. We have nothing to hide. They made their way back to the mountain trail, the watcher trailing them to the edge of town, but not beyond. The climb back was harder without the pelts, but with supplies to carry, and by the time they reached the cabin, both were exhausted. He's trying to intimidate us, Mara said as they unpacked. Make us nervous, prone to mistakes. Is it working? She smiled grimly. I've lived with fear for 6 months. One more man watching me doesn't change much. Her expression softened. Though it's different now. Now I have someone watching back. As evening approached, they prepared for the journey back to town to meet Rosa. Elias loaded the pistol and tucked a second knife into his boot. Mara used the mirror and scissors to trim her hair into something more respectable, the lamplight catching the auburn highlights among the silver. You look, Elias started, then stopped, unsure how to finish. Less like a witch, she suggested with dark humor. More like yourself, he corrected. Like the person you were before Walsh tried to break you. She set down the mirror, her expression vulnerable for a moment. That person is gone, Elias. She died somewhere between watching her parents buried and being sold on that platform. No, he said firmly. She's wounded, changed, but not gone. I see her every time you lift your chin in defiance, every time you fight for your sister. You see what you want to see. I see a survivor, and survivors don't have the luxury of dying inside, no matter how much easier it might be. The journey down the mountain in darkness was treacherous, but they moved carefully, aware that Walsh's men might be watching the trails. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate, and they reached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge without incident. Rosa's cottage was small but neat light, glowing warmly through curtained windows. They circled to the back, and Mara knocked softly. The door opened immediately, as if Rosa had been waiting. Come in quickly, she whispered, ushering them into a kitchen that smelled of beans and fresh tortillas. Juan Valdez sat at the table, his crutches leaning against the wall. Where his left leg should have been, his trouser leg was pinned up. His face was weathered but kind, and he stood awkwardly as they entered, balancing on his remaining leg. Please sit, Elias said. We're grateful you're willing to see us. Mara was kind to my sister, Juan said simply. When the others ignored her struggles, Mara shared her food, tried to protect her. We don't forget kindness. Tell us about your sister, Mara said gently. Walsh claimed it was pneumonia. Juan's face darkened. Pneumonia doesn't leave bruises around someone's throat. She tried to run, you see. The conditions in the mine quarters, they were killing her slowly. No heat in winter, barely any food, working 15-hour days in those unsafe tunnels. She tried to escape, and Walsh's foreman caught her. The same foreman who attacked me, Mara said. It wasn't a question. See, Brett Cooper. Evil man. When he died, some said it was justice. But your sister died first, Elias prompted. 2 weeks before. They brought her body out and said she'd gotten sick, died in her sleep. But I saw her. Those marks on her neck, they told a different story. Rosa had been silent, but now she spoke, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. Walsh owns the sheriff, the mayor, half the town council. Who would listen to a Mexican laborer and his wife? A federal judge might, Elias said. If we had evidence, testimony, multiple witnesses. Juan and Rosa exchanged glances. There are others, Rosa said slowly. Other families who've lost people, who've seen the abuses. But they're afraid. How many? Mara asked. Maybe a dozen families in town. More scattered through the valley, but Walsh has eyes everywhere. If he suspected we were organizing, he already suspects, Elias pointed out. That's why his men are watching us. The question is whether we act before he does. There's something else, Juan said. He hobbled to a cabinet and pulled out a worn leather journal. My sister, she could read and write, taught herself. She kept records of everything, the conditions, the punishments, the deaths that were covered up. She hid this in the mine before she tried to run. Mara took the journal with trembling hands, opening it carefully. Even in the dim light, they could see pages covered with neat handwriting, dates, names, incidents described in careful detail. This is evidence, she breathed. Real documented evidence. But it's not enough by itself, Juan warned. Walsh would claim it was fabricated, the ravings of a disturbed woman. Not if we had corroborating testimony. Elias said, his mind working quickly. Multiple witnesses telling the same stories, matching the dates and details in the journal. And my sister, Mara added, her voice tight with emotion. She's still there, still in those mine quarters. She could testify to current conditions. Rosa leaned forward. There's a gathering tomorrow night, a prayer meeting at the old mission outside town. Many of the Mexican families attend, including some who work for Walsh. If you came, spoke to them together, showed them the journal. It's dangerous, Juan warned. If Walsh finds out, he's going to move against us anyway, Elias interrupted. Morrison said he bought chains and rope. He's planning something, probably using the sheriff to make it look legal. We need allies before that happens. They spent another hour planning, Rosa providing names of families who might be sympathetic, Juan sketching a map of the mission and surrounding area. As they prepared to leave, Rosa pressed a bundle into Mara's hands. Bread and dried meat, she said. And this. She pulled out a small wooden cross on a leather cord. It was my mother's. For protection. Mara's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the gifts. We'll get justice for your sister-in-law, I swear it. Just stay alive, Rosa replied. The dead can't testify. The journey back to the cabin was tense, both of them alert for ambush. But the trail remained empty, the forest quiet except for the usual nocturnal sounds. As they climbed, Mara clutched the journal to her chest like a talisman. This changes everything, she said. With this, we might actually have a chance. We need to be smart about it, Elias cautioned. Walsh has resources we don't. Money men, influence. Our only advantages are surprise and the truth. And each other, Mara added softly. Back at the cabin, they lit only a single candle, aware that Walsh's men might be watching even here. By its flickering light, they read through the journal together, Mara translating some of the Spanish passages. The stories were heartbreaking. Maria Valdez had documented everything with a precision that spoke of desperate hope that someday someone would read her words and act. Workers beaten for minor infractions, women assaulted by foremen, children as young as 10 working in the mines, safety equipment denied to save costs, at least 7 deaths covered up as accidents or illness. Listen to this, Mara said, her voice thick with emotion. Today they brought Eliza Keene to the quarters, just 15 separated from her sister who protects her. Walsh says the pretty ones work the house, the plain ones work the mines. But Eliza is pretty, and still they sent her here. Punishment for her sister's defiance, Cooper says. The child cries at night for her sister. We try to comfort her, but what comfort can we give in hell? Elias watched Mara's face crumble as she read her sister's name. He moved closer, not touching, but offering presence. She's alive, he said firmly. That entry is from 3 weeks ago. She's alive and we're going to get her out. What if she hates me? Mara whispered. What if she thinks I abandoned her? Then you'll prove otherwise. You're here fighting for her. That's what matters. Mara wiped her eyes and continued reading. Near the end of the journal, the entries became more desperate, more fragmentary. The last entry, dated just days before Maria's death, was chilling in its simplicity. Cooper knows about the journal. God help us all. He killed her for this, Mara said, and then he came after me, probably thinking I knew about it. But the journal survived, Elias pointed out. Maria's testimony survived. We'll make sure her death wasn't in vain. They worked through the night, copying crucial passages, preparing their case. As dawn approached, exhaustion finally overtook them. Mara had fallen asleep at the table, her head pillowed on her arms, the journal beneath her protective hand. Elias covered her with a blanket, then stepped outside to watch the sunrise. The mountains were painted gold and pink, beautiful, and indifferent to human struggles. But change was coming. He could feel it like the pressure before a storm. A movement in the tree line caught his eye. A figure on horseback watching the cabin, not trying to hide, just observing. Even at a distance, Elias recognized the bulk of Brett Cooper's replacement, a man named Stokes, who had a reputation even worse than his predecessor. Elias raised his hand in a mocking wave. The rider remained motionless for another moment, then turned and disappeared into the forest. Let them watch, Elias murmured. Let them wonder what we're planning. Inside, Mara stirred, lifting her head and blinking in confusion before memory returned. Did I fall asleep? Just for a few hours, We have a visitor. He gestured toward the trees. Walsh's new foreman, keeping an eye on us. Mara stood and stretched, then moved to stand beside him. They're getting nervous. Good. Tonight's the prayer meeting, Elias reminded her. Are you ready for this? She touched the journal, now wrapped in oilcloth for protection. I've been ready since the day they separated me from Eliza. The question is whether the others are ready to stand with us. Only one way to find out. They spent the day preparing both practically and mentally. Elias cleaned and loaded every weapon they had while Mara practiced what she would say at the meeting, how she would present Maria's journal, how she would appeal to people's courage rather than their fear. Don't promise them safety, Elias advised. They know that's a lie. Promise them that their children won't have to live in fear of Walsh. Promise them dignity. Is dignity worth dying for? Mara asked. You tell me. You stood on that platform with a sack over your head, but you never bowed. Was that about survival or dignity? She considered this. Both. Survival without dignity isn't really living. It's just existing. As afternoon faded toward evening, they prepared for the journey to the mission. Mara wore her best dress, the one she'd been sold in, now cleaned and mended. She looked respectable, even with the scar, even with her unusual eyes. More importantly, she looked determined. Whatever happens tonight, Elias said as they prepared to leave, we've already won something. We've proven Walsh doesn't have the power he thinks he has. 2 people standing against him, that's a crack in his wall. Let's hope it's enough to bring the whole thing down, Mara replied. They left the cabin as dusk was falling, taking a circuitous route to avoid the main trails. The mission was 5 miles from town, an old Spanish structure that predated Cedar Ridge by decades. It served the Mexican community and anyone else too poor or unwelcome to attend the Protestant church in town. As they approached, they could see wagons and horses gathered outside, families arriving for the evening service. Children played in the courtyard while adults talked in small groups, their voices a mixture of Spanish and English. Several people recognized Mara, their expressions ranging from surprise to fear to something that might have been hope. She held her head high, meeting their gazes, directly letting them see that she was unbroken. Father Miguel, an elderly priest with kind eyes and gnarled hands, greeted them at the door. Rosa Valdez said you might come. You are welcome here, though I warn you not everyone will be receptive to what you have to say. We're not asking for everyone, Elias replied. Just enough. The interior of the mission was simple wooden benches, whitewashed walls, a carved altar that had probably come from Spain generations ago. About 40 people had gathered, mostly families, mostly poor, mostly bearing the subtle signs of hard labor and harder lives. Rosa and Juan were there, and Rosa nodded encouragingly as Mara and Elias found seats near the back. The service was conducted in a mixture of Latin and Spanish, with Father Miguel's voice rising and falling in ancient rhythms. When the formal service ended, Father Miguel spoke in English. We have visitors tonight who wish to address the community about matters of justice. I ask you to listen with open hearts. Mara stood the journal in her hands. Every eye turned to her, and Elias could feel the tension in the room ratchet up. My name is Mara Keene. She began, her voice clear and strong. Many of you know me. I worked at the Walsh Ranch until 3 days ago. Some of you saw me sold like livestock in the town square. Uncomfortable shifting from the audience, but no one spoke. I'm here because Maria Valdez can't be. She held up the journal. She left us her voice, her testimony about what happens at Walsh's mine, about the deaths he covers up, the abuses he permits, the children he forces into dangerous labor. We know all this, Guy, someone called out. But what can we do? He owns half the valley. He owns land and buildings, Mara corrected. He doesn't own us, not anymore. She began to read from the journal, Maria's words filling the mission with their quiet power. Dates, names, specific incidents. The crowd grew quieter as she read, some people weeping openly as they heard their own stories, their own losses reflected in Maria's careful documentation. When she finished, the silence was absolute. Then an older man stood. My nephew died in that mine last year. Walsh said it was a cave-in unavoidable, but Roberto had complained about the support beams, said they were rotten. Walsh ignored him. A woman stood next. My daughter works in the house. She comes home with bruises she won't explain. Says if she complains, the whole family will be thrown off the land we rent from Walsh. One by one, people stood and spoke. Stories of abuse, exploitation, fear. The dam had broken, and years of suppressed anger and grief poured out. But then a man near the door stood, his face hard. This is foolish talk. Walsh has the sheriff, the mayor, most of the town. You think a journal and some sad stories will change anything? He'll crush us all. He's already crushing us, Juan Valdez said, struggling to his feet. Slowly but surely. How many more have to die before we say enough? Easy for you to say, the man retorted. You already lost your leg. What about those of us still trying to feed our families? The meeting was fracturing fear battling against anger. Elias stood, drawing attention. You don't know me, he said. I'm the hermit from Thunder Mountain. I came to this valley to hide from the world to avoid exactly this kind of fight. But sometimes the fight comes to you whether you want it or not. He moved to stand beside Mara. Walsh thinks his money and influence make him untouchable. But there's a federal judge in Denver whose daughter cares about workers' rights. There are newspapers that would love a story about exploitation and murder in the Colorado mountains. Walsh is vulnerable, but only if we stand together. Pretty words, the skeptical man said. But who's going to get this evidence to Denver? Who's going to risk their neck? I am, Mara said. And before you say I have nothing to lose, remember my 15-year-old sister is still in those mine quarters. Every day I fight Walsh, I risk her life. But I'm more afraid of what happens if we don't fight. Father Miguel raised his hand for silence. This is a decision each family must make for themselves. But I will say this: evil flourishes when good people do nothing. And what is happening at the Walsh Ranch is evil. The meeting broke up with no clear resolution, people arguing in small groups, some fearful, some angry, some determined. But as Mara and Elias prepared to leave, Rosa approached with 5 other women. We'll testify, one said. Our husbands are afraid, but we've lost too much to be afraid anymore. 6 witnesses, another man said, joining them. 7 counting me. It's not everyone, but it's a start. They exchanged names, made plans to meet again to coordinate their testimony. As they talked, Elias noticed the skeptical man from earlier slip out of the mission. His instincts prickled. We need to go, he told Mara quietly. Now. She didn't question him, quickly finishing her conversation and following him out. They had barely reached the tree line when they heard horses approaching fast from the direction of town. Walsh's men, Elias said, pulling Mara into the deeper shadows. Someone informed. Through the trees, they watched a dozen riders surround the mission. Sheriff Brennan was in the lead with several of Walsh's ranch hands behind him. They burst into the mission, and soon shouts and screams echoed from within. We have to help them, Mara said, starting forward. Elias held her back. We can't. Not against those numbers. We'd just be arrested too, and then no one could speak for them. They watched in helpless fury as several men were dragged out, including Juan Valdez, who couldn't walk fast enough on his crutches and was roughly thrown to the ground. Rosa ran to him only to be backhanded by one of Walsh's men. Charges of sedition and conspiracy, Sheriff Brennan announced loudly. These people were plotting violence against a lawful landowner. Father Miguel emerged, his face thunderous. This is a house of God. You have no authority here. I have all the authority I need, Brennan replied, waving a paper. Judge's warrant. Seems there's been talk of uprising threats against Mr. Walsh's property and person. Lies, Father Miguel said firmly. We'll let the court decide that, after a proper investigation. Might take weeks. Brennan's smile was cold. Plenty of time for people to reconsider their positions. The arrested men were loaded onto a wagon, their families weeping and pleading. Mara trembled with rage beside Elias, her fingers white-knuckled around the journal. This is my fault, she whispered. I brought this on them. No, Elias said firmly. Walsh brought this on them. You just gave them the courage to speak. That's why he's reacting so strongly. He's afraid. They waited until the riders were gone, then crept back to the mission. Those who remained were terrified, some already packing to flee. Father Miguel was trying to maintain calm, but even he looked shaken. They knew exactly who to arrest, he said when he saw Mara and Elias. The ones who spoke up, who showed support. Someone here informed. It doesn't matter now, says Elias said. What matters is what we do next. What can we do? One woman wailed. They have our men. We get them out, Mara said, her voice hard as iron. And we get evidence to that federal judge. Tonight proved Walsh is desperate. Desperate men make mistakes. You're talking about war, Father Miguel said quietly. No, Elias corrected. Walsh declared war when he killed Maria Valdez, when he enslaved children, when he arrested innocent men for speaking truth. We're talking about justice. As they made their way back to the mountain, Mara was silent, the weight of the evening's events pressing down on her. 7 men arrested families terrorized their small coalition shattered before it could properly form. But as they climbed the familiar trail, Elias noticed something different about her silence. It wasn't defeat, it was calculation. You're planning something, he observed. Walsh made a mistake tonight, she said. He showed his hand too clearly. Arresting men at a prayer meeting on false charges with no real evidence that won't play well in federal court. If we can get it to federal court. She stopped and turned to him, her mismatched eyes gleaming in the moonlight. We will. But first we're going to give Walsh something else to worry about. What do you mean? My sister. We're going to get her out. Tomorrow night, while Walsh is busy gloating over tonight's arrests. Elias studied her face, seeing the determination etched in every line. That's dangerous. Maybe impossible. 3 days ago, buying a woman with a sack on her head was impossible too, she reminded him. But you did it anyway. That was different. No, it wasn't. You saw something wrong and acted even though it cost you everything. Now I'm asking you to help me do the same. They stood there on the mountain trail, the weight of decision between them. Below Cedar Ridge slept unaware that war had indeed been declared. Above their cabin waited no longer a refuge but a command post for an unlikely rebellion. All right, Elias said finally. We get your sister, but we do it smart. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. Mara smiled, that fierce expression that transformed her scarred face into something magnificent. Agreed, we'll be smart. She paused. Right after we're brave. The moon was already high when they reached the cabin, its silver light making the frost on the meadow grass sparkle like scattered diamonds. Neither spoke as they entered, both consumed with plans for tomorrow night's rescue attempt. Elias immediately went to his maps, spreading them across the table, while Mara lit every candle they had, needing the light to study the ranch layout she'd sketched from memory. The mine quarters are here, she said, pointing to a cluster of buildings she'd drawn near the eastern edge of Walsh's property. About a quarter mile from the main house separated by this ridge. That's our advantage, the ridge blocks sound and sight lines. Guards? 2, usually sometimes 3. They patrol, but they're lazy about it. Why guard people who have nowhere to run? Her finger traced a line through the rougher terrain. This dry creek bed runs close to the quarters. If we approach from the north, we can use it for cover most of the way. Elias studied the sketch, his mind already calculating distances, timing, potential problems. How many workers in the quarters? 20, maybe 25. Men in one building, women and children in another. Her voice caught slightly. Eliza will be with the women. That many people, we can't get them all out, not without being noticed. I know, Mara said quietly. Just Eliza. The others, we'll have to help them another way. The weight of that decision hung between them. Choosing to save one while leaving others behind went against everything they'd been fighting for, but attempting to rescue everyone would doom them all. After tonight's arrest, Walsh will be watching for retaliation, Elias pointed out. He might have increased guards. Or he might be overconfident, thinking he's broken our resistance. Mara moved to the window, staring out at the darkness. Either way, we can't wait. Every day Eliza stays there, she's in danger. Maria's journal mentions that younger girls sometimes just disappear. Elias joined her at the window. We'll need a distraction, something to draw attention away from the quarters. Fire, Mara suggested. Set one of the outer buildings ablaze. Too dangerous. Fire spreads fast out here, could kill innocents. He thought for a moment. What about the horses? Walsh prizes his bloodstock above almost everything. If something spooked them, got them running, every hand on the ranch would rush to round them up. Mara finished understanding, lighting her eyes. It could work, but how do we spook them without being there? Elias smiled grimly. Mountain tricks. I've had to scare off claim jumpers before. A few small explosive charges, nothing deadly but loud enough to panic horses. Set them with long fuses, we could be at the quarters when they go off. They worked through the night, refining their plan, discussing contingencies, preparing equipment. Elias showed Mara how to make the small charges using gunpowder and paper, how to cut fuses to burn at specific rates. She learned quickly, her hands steady despite the dangerous work. As dawn approached, exhaustion finally forced them to rest. But sleep wouldn't come for either of them, the weight of what they were about to attempt keeping them wakeful. "Tell me about Eliza," Elias said into the darkness. He'd given Mara the bed again while he lay on his bedroll by the dying fire. "She's everything I'm not," Mara replied softly. "Gentle trusting sees the good in everyone. Our parents used to say she got all the sweetness and I got all the stubbornness." A pause. "She has nightmares. Ever since we were children, I would hold her, sing to her until she calmed. I haven't been there for her nightmares in 6 months. You'll be there tomorrow night. If we succeed, if she's still herself." Elias understood what she couldn't say. 6 months in those quarters could break anyone, especially a gentle 15-year-old girl. They might rescue Eliza's body only to find her spirit already destroyed. "Whatever state she's in, she'll need you," he said firmly, "and you'll be there. That's what matters." Dawn came too soon, bringing with it a cold wind that spoke of winter's approach. They spent the day gathering final supplies, testing their makeshift explosives in the forest, well away from the cabin. The charges worked perfectly, creating sharp cracks that echoed off the mountain like gunshots. As afternoon wore on, a rider appeared on the trail below. Not one of Walsh's men, but Thomas Morrison from the general store, laboring up the steep path on a borrowed horse. Elias met him with rifle in hand, though he lowered it when he recognized the shopkeeper. "Morrison, risky coming up here." Morrison dismounted, breathing hard from the climb. "Had to warn you, Walsh is planning something big. He's called in Favor's hired guns from Denver. They arrive tomorrow." "How many?" Mara asked, emerging from the cabin. 20, maybe more. Professional mercenaries, not local ranch hands." Morrison pulled a letter from his coat. "This came for you, Ms. Keene, but Bespas, through my store, addressed to you, care of general delivery. No return address, but the postmark is Denver." Mara took the letter with trembling hands, recognizing the handwriting immediately. "It's from Catherine Harrison, the judge's daughter." She tore it open, reading quickly, her face paling with each line. "What does it say?" Elias asked. "She heard about the arrest. News travels fast when a federal judge's name is invoked falsely. Her father is furious that Walsh used his name on those warrants without permission." She looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "Judge Harrison is coming to Cedar Ridge. He'll be here in 3 days to investigate." 3 days, Morrison repeated. "But Walsh's mercenaries arrive tomorrow. He's planning to clean house before the judge arrives, make sure there's no evidence and no witnesses." The implications were clear. Walsh intended to eliminate anyone who might testify against him, probably claiming they were killed trying to escape or in some fabricated uprising. "We have to warn the others," Mara said urgently. "The families from the mission Rosa." "Already done," Morrison assured her. "Quietly spread word for people to lay low, stay together, stay in public places. But the men in jail, the workers at the ranch, they're sitting ducks." "Then we move tonight as planned," Elias decided. "Get Eliza out before those mercenaries arrive. Tomorrow, we figure out how to protect the others." Morrison handed over another package. "Ammunition. Figured you might need it. And this." He pulled out a deputy's badge. "It's real. Sheriff Brennan lost it in a poker game years ago. I've had it in my store ever since. Might come in handy if you need to look official." "Why are you helping us?" Mara asked. "Walsh could destroy your business." Morrison was quiet for a moment. "My daughter would have been about Eliza's age. Died of scarlet fever 5 years ago. When I heard about that girl in the mine quarters crying for her sister," he cleared his throat. "Some things matter more than business." After Morrison left, they made final preparations. Elias cleaned and loaded every weapon they had while Mara dressed in dark clothes suitable for night work. She'd found an old pair of his trousers and cut them down to fit tucked into her boots. With her hair pulled back and her face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, she looked dangerous and capable. "You sure you want to do this?" Elias asked one final time as dusk fell. I've never been more sure of anything, she replied, checking the knife at her belt. Except maybe trusting you that day on the platform. They set out as darkness claimed the valley, taking a circuitous route that added miles but kept them away from traveled roads. The explosive charges were divided between them, wrapped carefully to prevent accidental detonation. The night was cold and clear, perfect for sound to carry both an advantage and a danger. It took 3 hours to reach the outskirts of Walsh's ranch, moving carefully through rough terrain. They could see lights in the main house, hear music and laughter. Walsh was celebrating his victory over the prayer-meeting rebels. Arrogant bastard, Mara whispered, throwing a party while people suffer in his jail and his mines. They circled wide toward the horse paddock, staying low and moving between patches of shadow. The bloodstock Walsh prized so highly were in a large corral near the main barn, 24 magnificent animals worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. Elias set the charges carefully around the corral's perimeter, hiding them in brush and against fence posts. The fuses were cut to different lengths. Some would blow in 30 minutes. Others in 35, creating a rolling series of explosions that would send the horses into prolonged panic. Remember, he whispered to Mara, once these go off, we have maybe 10 minutes before someone thinks to check the quarters. We get in, find Eliza, get out. No heroics. She nodded, though he could see the struggle in her eyes. Leaving the others behind went against every instinct she had. They made their way toward the mine quarters using the dry creek bed as Mara had suggested. The buildings looked even more dismal up close, unpainted wood structures that seemed to huddle against the cold windows covered with burlap instead of glass. A small fire burned in a barrel between the buildings, providing the only light. 2 guards were visible, but as Mara had predicted, they were relaxed, sharing a bottle of whiskey by the fire. Why guard people who had nowhere to run and no hope of rescue? They waited, counting down minutes. Then the first charge exploded. The crack echoed across the valley like thunder. Horses screamed, and almost immediately shouts erupted from the main house. The guards by the quarters jumped up, looking toward the corrals. The second charge went off, then the third. The night filled with the sound of panicked horses and shouting men. Go check that out, one guard told the other. I'll watch here. Elias cursed silently. They'd hoped both guards would respond to the emergency. As the second guard ran toward the chaos, Elias made a quick decision. He emerged from the shadows behind the remaining guard, bringing his rifle butt down hard on the man's head. The guard crumpled without a sound. Quickly, he urged Mara. She was already at the door to the women's quarters, using her knife to pry at the padlock. It came free with a snap of metal, and she pushed inside. The interior was worse than Elias had imagined. 20 women and girls crammed into a space meant for half that number, sleeping on bare floor with only thin blankets against the cold. The air reeked of unwashed bodies and despair. Eliza, Mara called softly. Eliza, it's me. Faces turned toward them, eyes reflecting the faint light from outside. Hope, fear, and confusion warred in their expressions. Then, from the far corner, a small voice, Mara. A girl stumbled forward so thin and dirty, Elias wouldn't have recognized her as Mara's sister without the familiar eyes, the same brown as Mara's left eye, wide with disbelief. It's me, Mara said, catching Eliza as she collapsed into her arms. I'm here. I'm taking you away. We can't all go, an older woman said, understanding immediately what was happening. They'll hunt us down, kill us all. Federal judge is coming in 3 days, Elias said quickly. Stay alive until then. Say nothing about this. You never saw us. More explosions echoed from the corrals. They were running out of time. The others, Eliza whispered, clinging to Mara. We can't leave them. We have to, Mara said, her voice breaking. But we're coming back for everyone. I swear it. She half carried Eliza toward the door, the girl so weakened by months of hard labor and poor food that she could barely walk. Other women reached out, touching them as they passed, silent blessings, desperate hope, transferred through brief contact. Outside, the night was chaos. Men ran everywhere trying to contain horses that had scattered in all directions. But it wouldn't last long. Already some of the animals were being rounded up. They made it to the creek bed before shouts arose from the quarters. The guard had been found, the open door discovered. But in the darkness and confusion, pursuit was disorganized. Eliza collapsed twice during the escape, her body pushed beyond its limits. Elias ended up carrying her while Mara covered their retreat, the old pistol ready in her hand. They could hear search parties behind them, see torches spreading out across the ranch. "This way," Elias said, veering from their planned route. "They'll expect us to head for the mountains." Instead, he led them toward the river that marked the ranch's eastern boundary. The water was low this time of year, but still cold enough to shock the breath from their lungs as they waded across. Eliza whimpered but didn't cry out, burying her face in Elias's shoulder. On the far side, they took shelter in a grove of cottonwoods, listening to the pursuit mill around on the opposite bank. The searchers were reluctant to cross the water in darkness, unsure which direction their quarry had gone. "We need to keep moving," Mara whispered, though she looked ready to collapse herself. "Not yet," Elias said. "Let them spread out waste energy searching the wrong areas. We'll move before dawn." They huddled together for warmth, Eliza between them, shaking from cold and trauma. In the faint moonlight, Elias could see bruises on her arms, cuts on her hands from mine work. Her fingernails were broken and bloody, her hair matted beyond salvaging. "I thought you forgot about me," Eliza whispered to Mara. "They said you were sold, that you didn't want me anymore." "Never," Mara said fiercely, holding her sister tighter. "I thought about you every day, planned how to get you back. I'm so sorry it took this long." "The others helped me," Eliza said. "Maria especially, before she died. She said you were strong, that you'd find a way." "Maria Valdez." Eliza nodded. "She protected the younger girls, shared her food even when there wasn't enough. They killed her for it, for being kind." Mara and Elias exchanged glances over Eliza's head, another crime to add to Walsh's account. As the search parties moved further away, they began their careful journey back to the mountain. Elias carried Eliza most of the way, her weight negligible compared to the loads he was used to hauling. Mara walked beside them, alert for any sign of pursuit, but the night remained quiet except for distant shouts from the ranch. Dawn was breaking as they finally reached the cabin, all three of them exhausted beyond measure. Elias set Eliza gently on the bed while Mara immediately began heating water for washing and tending wounds. In the growing light, Eliza's condition was even more shocking. Months of malnutrition had left her skeletal, her skin stretched tight over prominent bones. Infected cuts covered her hands and arms. Her feet were so damaged from inadequate shoes that several toenails were missing. "My God." Mara breathed, tears running down her face as she began cleaning her sister's wounds. "What did they do to you?" "Nothing special," Eliza said with heartbreaking matter-of-factness. "This is how everyone looks in the quarters. I was actually lucky some of the girls had it worse." While Mara tended to Eliza, Elias kept watch from the window. It wouldn't take Walsh long to figure out where Eliza had been taken. The question was whether he'd risk a direct assault on the cabin or try more subtle means. "Riders," he announced around midday. 6 of them. But they're stopping at the tree line. Mara joined him at the window, leaving Eliza sleeping on the bed. The riders sat their horses just visible through the trees, watching the cabin. "They're not attacking," Mara observed. "No, they're containing us, keeping us here while Walsh makes other plans." Elias frowned. "Those mercenaries Morrison mentioned, they arrived today." As if in response to his words, one of the riders produced a white flag, riding slowly toward the cabin. Elias recognized him as Stokes Walsh's new foreman. "That's close enough," Elias called from the porch rifle, visible but not quite aimed. Stokes stopped 30 yards away. "Mr. Walsh wants to make a deal." "No deals," Mara said, stepping out beside Elias. "You might want to hear this one," Stokes said with an unpleasant smile. "See, we got your friends from the prayer meeting locked up nice and tight. 7 men, including that cripple Valdez. Shame if something happened to them while trying to escape." "You're threatening to murder 7 innocent men?" Elias asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Not threatening anything, just saying accidents happen in jail. Desperate men do desperate things." Stokes shifted in his saddle. "But Mr. Walsh is a reasonable man. Return the girl and those men go free. Simple trade." "And if we refuse?" Mara asked, though she already knew the answer. Then tomorrow morning, Cedar Ridge wakes up to 7 dead conspirators who tried to escape justice. Their blood will be on your hands. No, Elias said firmly. Their blood will be on Walsh's hands where it belongs. Stokes shrugged. Either way, they'll be dead. You have until dawn to decide. Return the girl to the ranch, or 7 men die. He turned his horse and rode back to the tree line, leaving Mara and Elias standing in terrible silence. We can't, Elias said finally. We can't send her back. And we can't let 7 innocent men die for our choices, Mara countered, agony in her voice. From the bed, Eliza spoke, startling them both. They hadn't realized she was awake. I'll go back, she said quietly. I won't have deaths on my conscience. No, Mara said immediately, rushing to her sister's side. We didn't fight this hard to lose you again. Then what do we do? Eliza asked with a maturity beyond her years. Let them die. How do we live with that? Elias's mind raced, calculating possibilities. The judge arrives in 2 days. If we can keep everyone alive until then, how we're trapped here and Walsh holds all the cards. A memory stirred in Elias's mind, something Morrison had given them. Maybe not all the cards, he said slowly, pulling out the deputy's badge. This might be worthless, or it might be just enough to cause confusion. What are you thinking, Guilles? Mara asked. I'm thinking Walsh isn't the only one who can hire help. There are good people in Cedar Ridge, people who are tired of Walsh's stranglehold on the valley. If we could rally them, create enough chaos to prevent the executions until the judge arrives. That's a lot of ifs, Mara pointed out. Do you have a better idea? She was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. But we can't both go. Someone needs to stay with Eliza. I'll go, Elias said. No, it has to be me. She held up a hand to stop his protest. You're the mountain man, the hermit. People respect you, but they don't trust you. I'm the woman from the auction block, the one who stood up to Walsh. Like it or not, I've become a symbol. If anyone can rally the town, it's me. Elias wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. Those men in the trees won't let you pass. Not openly, but there are other ways down the mountain, paths even you don't know. She gave him a small smile. I didn't spend 6 months at Walsh's ranch without learning the terrain. It's too dangerous, Eliza protested weakly. Everything we do now is dangerous, Mara replied. But doing nothing is death. She prepared quickly, changing into her darkest clothes, taking the pistol and extra ammunition. As night fell, she hugged Eliza tightly, whispered something in her ear that made the girl nod solemnly. If I don't come back, she began, turning to Elias. You will, he interrupted. You have to. Your sister needs you. Take care of her, Mara said simply. Then impulsively she reached up and kissed his cheek. Thank you for everything. Before he could respond, she slipped out the back door and vanished into the darkness. Elias watched from the window, but even knowing she was out there, he couldn't spot her movement. The watchers in the trees remained focused on the front of the cabin, unaware that their quarry was slipping past them like a ghost. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Eliza drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes calling for Mara, sometimes whimpering from nightmares. Elias tended the fire and kept watch, wondering what was happening in town, whether Mara had made it safely. Near midnight, he saw movement in the trees. The watchers were changing shifts, but there was something else, an agitation in their movements, urgent whispers he couldn't quite hear. Something had happened in town. Dawn was still hours away when the first flames appeared in the valley. Not the ranch, the jail. The building was on fire. Orange light visible even from the mountain. Elias's heart raced. What had Mara done? More fires sprouted, small ones scattered through the town. Not enough to threaten lives, but enough to create chaos. Every able-bodied person would be fighting the flames, including Walsh's men. Clever, Elias murmured, understanding her strategy. Can't execute prisoners who've already escaped during a fire. The watchers in the trees were clearly torn, some riding toward town while others remained. Their containment was breaking down. Then, through the pre-dawn darkness, Elias heard something that made his blood sing voices. Many voices moving up the mountain trail. Not trying to be stealthy, but making their presence known. As the first light of dawn touched the peaks, a crowd emerged from the forest. Townspeople, dozens of them led by Mara, who walked with Father Miguel on one side and Thomas Morrison on the other. Behind them came Rosa Valdez supporting her limping husband, the other families from the prayer meeting, and surprisingly several prominent citizens, including the banker and the newspaper editor. The remaining watchers took one look at the crowd and fled, recognizing that the tide had turned. Mara broke from the group and ran to the cabin, bursting through the door, with triumph blazing in her eyes. "The prisoners are safe," she announced breathlessly, "hidden in the church with Father Miguel's protection. And that's not all the newspaper editor telegraphed Denver last night. The story will be in tomorrow's paper front page. Walsh's kingdom is crumbling." "How?" Elias asked, amazed. "People were ready. They just needed someone to light the match." She moved to the bed where Eliza was struggling to sit up. "And when they heard about you, little sister, about all the children in those quarters, even Walsh's supporters couldn't stomach it." Outside, the crowd was growing as more people arrived from town. Someone had brought a wagon to transport Eliza safely. Others carried food, blankets, medical supplies. "The judge will be here tomorrow," Morrison called out. "Walsh is barricaded in his ranch with his mercenaries, but he's finished. Too many witnesses, too much evidence." But even as they celebrated this victory, Elias noticed Mara's expression remained troubled. "What is it?" he asked quietly. "The other workers at the ranch. They're still trapped there. Walsh might use them as hostages or worse, eliminate them before the judge arrives." The crowd heard her words, and silence fell. They'd won a battle, but the war wasn't over. "Then we go get them," someone called out. Elias was surprised to recognize the banker, a man he'd thought firmly in Walsh's pocket. "All of them. Today." "That's suicide," another voice protested. "Walsh has professional guns now." "And we have numbers," Rosa Valdez said firmly. "And more importantly, we have right on our side." Father Miguel raised his hand for silence. "Violence begets violence. We must find another way." "What if we don't have to fight?" Elias said slowly, an idea forming. "What if we make it impossible for Walsh to fight?" All eyes turned to him. "Walsh's men are mercenaries. They fight for money, not loyalty. What if suddenly their employer couldn't pay them?" Morrison caught on first. "The bank could call in his loans. I know he's overextended." The banker nodded slowly. "With the federal investigation pending, I'd have grounds. But it would take time." "We don't need to actually do it," Elias interrupted. "Just make the mercenaries think it's happening. Make them doubt they'll get paid. Mercenaries don't work for free." Mara was smiling now, that fierce expression he'd come to treasure. "And if we could get word to the workers that help is coming, that they should be ready." The planning began in earnest, the crowd organizing with surprising efficiency. Some would spread word about Walsh's financial troubles. Others would create diversions. A brave few volunteered to sneak close to the ranch and communicate with the workers. "I'm going too," Eliza said, trying to stand. "You can barely walk," Mara protested. "I don't need to walk." "But those workers know me, trust me. If they see I'm free, they'll believe rescue is possible." It was dangerous, but she was right. Hope was as powerful a weapon as any gun. As the sun climbed higher, the unlikely army prepared to march on Walsh's ranch. Elias stood with Mara, watching the crowd with amazement. "3 days ago you were on an auction block," he said. "Now you're leading a revolution." "3 days ago I was alone," she corrected. "Now I have an army. And more importantly, but..." She looked at him with those remarkable eyes. "I have a partner." The crowd began moving down the mountain, their voices rising in an old Spanish hymn Father Miguel had started. It was a song of deliverance, of chains breaking and captives going free. Walsh had made a critical error. He'd thought fear would keep people in line, but he'd forgotten that desperation breeds courage, and that sometimes all it takes is one person standing up to inspire hundreds to follow. As they marched toward the final confrontation, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death, not just purpose, but joy. The hermit of Thunder Mountain had found more than a partner in Marrakeen. He'd found a reason to rejoin the world, to fight for something beyond mere survival. Behind them, Eliza rode in the wagon, wrapped in blankets but with her head held high. Around them, the people of Cedar Ridge marched together, Mexican and Anglo, rich and poor all united against a common enemy. And ahead Walsh's ranch waited its owner about to learn that money and guns were no match for a community that had finally found its courage. The crowd moved like a river down the mountain road, their hymn echoing off the valley walls. As they approached the outskirts of Walsh's ranch, the singing gradually died away, replaced by a tense silence. The main gate came into view, and behind it, a line of armed men, the mercenaries from Denver, their rifles gleaming in the morning sun. "That's far enough," called out their leader, a scarred man with cold eyes, who looked like he'd killed for far less than Walsh was paying him. "This is private property. Turn around now or we open fire." Father Miguel stepped forward, his weathered hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We've come for the workers. Let them go, and there need be no violence." The mercenary laughed an ugly sound that made several people in the crowd step back. "The workers are Mr. Walsh's legal property. You want to dispute that, take it up with the courts." "The federal court is already involved," Morrison called out, producing a telegram. "Judge Harrison arrives tomorrow. Any violence against civilians will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." The mercenary's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, a commotion arose from behind the ranch buildings. Smoke began rising from the direction of the mine quarters. Not the controlled smoke of a chimney, but the black billowing clouds of a structure fire. "The quarters are burning," someone in the crowd shouted. The mercenaries turned in confusion, some moving toward the fire, others maintaining their position at the gate. In that moment of chaos, Elias saw their opportunity. "Now," he whispered to Mara. She produced the deputy's badge Morrison had given them and held it high. "By the authority vested in me by the federal court, I order you to stand down and allow us to assist with the fire." It was a bluff of magnificent proportions. The badge gave her no such authority, but in the confusion with smoke rising and crowds pressing forward, the mercenaries hesitated. That hesitation was enough. The crowd surged forward not violently, but with determined purpose, flowing around the mercenaries like water around stones. Some ran toward the fire with buckets, others toward the quarters to help evacuate workers. The mercenaries outnumbered 20 to 1, and uncertain of their legal standing, fell back rather than open fire on unarmed civilians. Elias and Mara ran toward the burning quarters, where workers were stumbling out coughing from smoke. The fire had started in the men's building later. They would learn it was deliberately set by the workers themselves when they'd seen the crowd approaching, knowing it would provide the distraction needed for escape. "This way," Mara shouted, directing confused and frightened people toward the waiting wagons that townspeople had brought. "You're safe now. You're free." But even as workers poured out of the quarters, Elias noticed something troubling. "Where's Walsh?" Mara looked around, her face paling. "And where's Stokes?" The answer came in the form of gunshots from the main house. Not the random fire of panic, but measured, deliberate shots. Someone screamed, and Elias saw Rosa Valdez fall, blood spreading across her shoulder. "Take cover!" he shouted as more shots rang out. The crowd scattered, some dragging the wounded to safety, others taking shelter behind wagons and buildings. The mercenaries, seeing actual combat beginning, started to reform their line, though they seemed uncertain who they should be fighting. From an upper window of the main house, Walsh appeared, a rifle in his hands. "You want a war?" he shouted, his face contorted with rage. "I'll give you a war. Every one of you is trespassing. I have every right to defend my property, including the right to murder." Father Miguel called back, standing in the open, despite the danger, his arms around a terrified child who'd run from the quarters. "These are human beings, not property." "I have legal contracts," Walsh screamed, "signed and witnessed. Contracts obtained through fraud and coercion," a new voice said, strong and authoritative. Everyone turned to see a distinguished older man in a black suit stepping down from a carriage that had just arrived. "And I should know, since my name was used to authorize them without my knowledge or consent." Judge Harrison had arrived a day early. The federal judge walked through the chaos with remarkable calm, his presence commanding immediate attention. 2 federal marshals flanked him, their badges gleaming with unmistakable authority. "Mr. Walsh," the judge called out, his voice carrying the weight of federal law, "I order you to cease fire immediately and surrender yourself for questioning." "You have no authority here," Walsh shouted back, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "I have every authority," Judge Harrison replied. including sworn affidavits from 7 witnesses detailing murder assault and illegal imprisonment on this property. He held up a sheaf of papers. Your victims found their way to my hotel last night despite your attempts to silence them. The mercenaries were backing away now, recognizing that the situation had fundamentally changed. Fighting civilians was one thing, fighting federal marshals was quite another. You, Judge Harrison addressed the mercenary leader. What's your name? Coleman, Your Honor. Jack Coleman, out of Denver. Mr. Coleman, are you aware that you've been hired to defend an illegal operation that makes you an accessory to Mr. Walsh's crimes? Coleman's scarred face went pale. We were told this was a legal property dispute, Your Honor. Protection of assets from theft and trespass. Then you were lied to. I suggest you and your men stand down immediately unless you want to face federal charges. The mercenaries lowered their weapons, stepping away from the gate. Without them, Walsh's position crumbled. But the man himself wasn't ready to surrender. You don't understand, Walsh shouted. I built this ranch from nothing. These people owe me everything. They owe you nothing, Mara said, stepping forward despite Elias's attempt to hold her back. You stole their freedom, their dignity, their lives. Maria Valdez documented everything before you had her murdered. She held up the journal, its pages visible even from a distance. Names, dates, crimes, all witnessed, all verified. Walsh's rifle swung toward her. You, he snarled. This is all your fault. If you'd just submitted, none of this would have happened. If I'd submitted, you'd have destroyed me like you destroyed the others, Mara replied, not flinching even with the rifle pointed at her chest. But I didn't break and neither did they, and now your kingdom of fear is ending. Not if I end you first, Walsh said, his finger moving to the trigger. The shot was impossibly loud in the morning air. But it wasn't Walsh's rifle that had fired. The rancher stumbled, looking down in shock at the spreading red stain on his chest. Behind him, visible in the window, stood someone no one had expected, Stokes Walsh's own foreman, holding a smoking pistol. Why? Walsh gasped, falling to his knees. Because I'm tired of cleaning up your messes, Stokes said coldly, and because Judge Harrison offered me a deal testimony for immunity. You were going down anyway, Walsh. At least this way I don't go with you. Walsh collapsed forward, his rifle clattering across the floor. Some in the crowd cheered, others stood in shocked silence. Elias moved immediately to Mara, pulling her back from the line of fire, but the danger had passed. Judge Harrison nodded to his marshals. Arrest Mr. Stokes. Immunity doesn't mean freedom. He'll serve time, just not hang. He turned to address the crowd. As for the rest of you, any person held under an indenture contract on this property is hereby freed pending a full investigation. Those contracts are suspended by federal authority. The crowd erupted in celebration, former workers embracing their families, tears of joy mixing with the lingering smoke from the fire. But Elias noticed Mara wasn't celebrating. She was scanning the crowd, searching. Eliza, she said suddenly. Where's Eliza? They found her by the women's quarters, kneeling beside an elderly Mexican woman who hadn't made it out of the building in time. Eliza was holding the woman's hand, speaking softly to her in broken Spanish, offering comfort in her final moments. She was too weak to run, Eliza explained through tears when Mara reached her. The smoke her lungs. I couldn't leave her to die alone. Mara knelt beside her sister, and together they stayed with the old woman until she passed her weathered hand going slack in Eliza's gentle grip. It was a small tragedy in the midst of liberation, but it reminded everyone that freedom had come at a cost. Father Miguel performed last rites while the crowd stood in respectful silence. Then, as the sun climbed toward noon, the grim business of sorting through Walsh's crimes began in earnest. Judge Harrison set up a temporary court in Walsh's own dining room, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on anyone. One by one, workers came forward to testify their stories, painting a picture of systematic abuse that shocked even the judge's experienced marshals. How did this go on for so long? Judge Harrison asked at one point, genuine bewilderment in his voice. Because no one believed we mattered, Juan Valdez answered simply, Rosa beside him with her shoulder bandaged, but her spirit unbroken. We were poor, foreign, desperate, easy to exploit, easy to ignore. Not anymore, the judge said firmly. Every crime will be documented, every victim compensated. Mr. Walsh's assets will be liquidated to pay reparations. As the afternoon wore on, Elias found himself standing outside with Mara watching as families were reunited and workers walked freely for the first time in months or years. Eliza sat nearby wrapped in blankets, but refusing to go rest, needing to witness this moment of liberation she'd dreamed of for so long. "What happens now?" Mara asked quietly. "The judge will need weeks to sort through everything," Elias replied. "Testimony to record assets to distribute crimes to prosecute. It'll be a long process." "I meant what happens to us." She clarified, those remarkable eyes finding his. "You bought a woman at auction and ended up leading a revolution. Not exactly what you planned when you came down from your mountain." "No," he agreed. "But then again, hiding in the mountains wasn't much of a plan either, just existence without purpose. And now—" He looked at her, this fierce, scarred, beautiful woman who'd awakened something in him he'd thought dead forever. "Now I think maybe it's time to stop hiding." Before she could respond, Thomas Morrison approached with Judge Harrison's daughter, Catherine, who had arrived with her father. Catherine was everything the rumors suggested, young, passionate, and absolutely furious about what she'd discovered at the ranch. "Miss Keene," Catherine said, taking Mara's hands in hers, "Father has told me about your courage. I want to help. There's work to be done here, but also in Denver and Washington. The country needs to know what happened here to make sure it can't happen again." "I'm no activist," Mara protested. "I just wanted my sister back." "The best activists never set out to be," Catherine replied. "They're just people who couldn't stand by and watch injustice. People like you." As they talked, Elias noticed movement near the burned quarters. Some of the workers weren't leaving, instead gathering in small groups, talking anxiously. He moved closer to listen. "Where will we go?" one woman was asking. "We have no homes, no money, no work." "The ranch needs workers," a man replied. "Maybe the judge will let us stay work for real wages." "After everything that happened here," another protested, "this place is cursed." Elias returned to where Judge Harrison was holding court. "Your Honor, what's to become of the ranch itself?" The judge looked up from his papers. "It will be sold to pay reparations, I expect, though finding a buyer for a property with such a dark history won't be easy." "What if the workers bought it?" Elias suggested. "Collectively. Used their reparation money to purchase shares. They know the land, the operations. They could run it as a cooperative." Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose. "That's actually not a bad idea. It would require organization leadership, but—" He looked thoughtful. "Miss Keene, would you consider staying to help organize such an effort?" Mara looked at Eliza, who nodded eagerly. "The workers trust you," Eliza said. "You stood up for them when no one else would." "I know nothing about running a ranch," Mara protested. "But you know about fighting for people," Morrison interjected. "And there are plenty here who know the practical side. Together—" The idea took hold, quickly spreading through the gathered workers like wildfire. By evening, an impromptu meeting had formed in the yard with Father Miguel helping to translate and organize the discussion. The possibility of owning the land they'd been forced to work, of building something positive from Walsh's evil empire, energized people who'd seemed broken just hours before. As night fell, Elias found himself back at Walsh's house, now transformed into a makeshift headquarters for the federal investigation. The man himself had been laid out in the barn awaiting burial. No one mourned him. Stokes was in custody, providing detailed testimony about Walsh's crimes in exchange for a reduced sentence. His revelations were damning, not just about the ranch, but about a network of similar operations throughout the territory, all using questionable indenture contracts to essentially enslave desperate workers. "This is bigger than just one ranch," Judge Harrison told Elias and Mara privately. "We're going to need witnesses willing to testify in federal court, possibly for months. Are you prepared for that?" "We've come this far," Mara said firmly. "We'll see it through." Later that night, they made their way back to Elias's cabin, bringing Eliza with them. The girl was exhausted, but insisted she felt safer on the mountain than anywhere in the valley. As they climbed the familiar trail, Elias noticed how different it felt. For 3 years, this had been his escape route, his path away from humanity. Now it felt like a road home. The cabin was as they'd left it that morning, though it felt like a lifetime had passed. Elias built up the fire while Mara settled Eliza in the bed, the girl falling asleep almost instantly, despite the day's trauma. "She's strong," Mara said softly, watching her sister sleep. Stronger than I gave her credit for. Strength runs in the family, Elias observed. They sat by the fire, processing the day's events in companionable silence. Finally, Mara spoke. Catherine Harrison wants me to go to Denver with her, to speak at rallies, write articles about what happened here, to turn this into a larger movement for workers' rights. Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. Will you go? I don't know. Eliza needs stability time to heal, and the ranch cooperative will need help getting started. But Catherine's right. If we don't tell this story widely, it'll happen again elsewhere. You could do both, Elias suggested, though the words hurt to say. Go to Denver for a few weeks, then come back. I could look after Eliza while you're gone. Mara turned to study him, firelight dancing across her scarred face. Is that what you want? For me to leave? I want you to do what's right, he said carefully. You've found your voice, your purpose. I won't be the one to silence it. My purpose, she repeated thoughtfully. For 6 months, my only purpose was survival. Then it was saving Eliza. Then freeing the others. Now, she paused, seeming to gather courage. Now I think my purpose might be larger than any cause. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, she moved closer to him on the bench they shared. Do you still think about Margaret? The question surprised him. Every day, but differently now. Hausa, before thinking of her, was like pressing on a wound, all pain, no purpose. Now, he struggled to find the words. Now I think she'd be proud of what we did today. She believed in justice, in standing up for people who couldn't stand for themselves. She would have liked you. Even with my scars, my strange eyes, my dangerous reputation. Especially because of those things, Elias said firmly. They're proof you survived what should have broken you. Margaret admired survivors. Mara was quiet for a moment. I need to tell you something. That morning on the auction block under the sack, I could see through the weave a little. Not much, just shadows and shapes. I saw you in the crowd standing apart from the others. You looked as broken as I felt. I was, he admitted. But you bid anyway. Why? Really? Why? Elias thought back to that moment, trying to recapture what had driven him. Because for just a second, when you stood there refusing to bow despite everything, I remembered what it felt like to fight for something. You reminded me that broken doesn't mean defeated. You saved me, she said simply. We saved each other, he corrected. And then we saved others. That's what partners do. Partners, she repeated, and something in her tone made him look at her more closely. Is that all we are? The question hung between them like a held breath. 3 days ago they'd been strangers, but those 3 days had contained more life, more purpose, more connection than the 3 years that preceded them. I'm not good at this, Elias said quietly. After Margaret, I shut down that part of myself, told myself it was safer not to feel, not to care beyond basic survival. And now I'm terrified, he admitted, because I care about what happens to you more than I care about my own safety. Because when you kissed my cheek before going to town, I wanted to call you back, keep you safe, even though I knew you had to go. Because when Walsh pointed that rifle at you, I would have done anything, sacrificed anything to stop him from pulling that trigger. Mara reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. I'm terrified too. I've been broken so many times I don't know if I have the pieces to build something new. But when I'm with you, I feel whole. Not fixed, not healed, but whole, despite the breaks. The Japanese have a word for that, Elias said, remembering something Margaret had once told him. Kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, making it more beautiful for having been broken. Gold seems a bit fancy for us, Mara said with a small smile. Maybe we use something more practical. Steel, perhaps, or stubbornness. She laughed, the sound warming the cabin more than any fire could. Definitely stubbornness. They sat together in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the fire die down to embers. Finally, Mara spoke again. I won't go to Denver. Not yet. Maybe someday when Eliza is stronger, when the cooperative is established. But right now, my place is here. Here at the ranch. Here with you, she corrected. If you'll have us. Eliza and me. We're not easy companions. She has nightmares. I have a temper. We both have more wounds than we know how to handle. This cabin's too small for 3 people long term, Elias said practically, though his heart was racing. We'd need to build on ad rooms, and the trail's too rough for regular travel to the valley. We'd need to improve it, maybe get horses now that the ranch's assets are being distributed. Is that a yes? He turned to face her, fully reaching up to trace the scar on her face with gentle fingers. That's a yes to building something together. Not just a cabin, but a life. Broken pieces made whole through joining. This time when she kissed him, it wasn't on the cheek. It was a kiss that tasted of smoke and tears of fear, conquered and hope discovered. It was a promise and a question and an answer all at once. When they finally pulled apart, Mara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Margaret was a lucky woman to be loved by you. And I'm a lucky man to find love twice in one lifetime. Different loves, but both real, both worth fighting for. A sound from the bed made them turn. Eliza was awake, watching them with a small smile despite the exhaustion evident in her features. Don't mind me, she said weakly. I'm just enjoying seeing my sister happy for the first time in forever. Mara moved to sit beside her, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. Rest, little one. Tomorrow we start building our new life. All of us? Eliza asked, including Elias in her glance. All of us, he confirmed. Family doesn't always come the way you expect it. As the night deepened, they settled into a new configuration, Mara and Eliza sharing the bed while Elias kept watch by the dying fire. But it didn't feel like separation. It felt like the beginning of something, a foundation being laid for whatever came next. Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season, covering the violence and triumph of the day with a blanket of pristine white. The mountain didn't care about human struggles, but it would shelter those who respected it, those who understood that survival meant more than just staying alive. In the morning, they would return to the valley to help build the cooperative, to testify to federal authorities, to help other broken people find their own gold-mended wholeness. There would be challenges, setbacks, probably threats from those who profited from the old system. But tonight, in a small cabin on Thunder Mountain, 3 wounded souls had found their way to each other. A hermit who'd bought a woman in a sack had discovered that saving someone else could mean saving yourself. A woman who'd refused to break had learned that strength could include accepting help. And a girl who'd survived hell had witnessed that love could bloom even in the harshest ground. The fire crackled its last ember song of ending and beginning. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing tracks and trails, offering the gift of a clean start. And in the darkness, 3 people who'd been alone found themselves part of something larger, not just a cause or a mission, but a family forged in struggle and sealed with hope. Walsh's ranch would become a cooperative run by the people who'd suffered under his rule. The federal investigation would expose similar operations throughout the territory. Catherine Harrison would write articles that would appear in newspapers from Denver to Washington, sparking discussions about labor rights and human dignity. But those were tomorrow's victories. Tonight's triumph was simpler and more profound. 3 people choosing to face the future together, their broken pieces aligned to create something stronger than what had come before. The snow whispered against the windows, winter's first promise that hard times were coming. But inside the cabin, warmth prevailed. Not just the warmth of fire and shelter, but the deeper warmth of connection, of purpose, of love, discovered in the most unlikely circumstances. Elias dozed in his chair, one hand resting on his rifle out of habit, but his face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for 3 years. Mara lay awake, holding her sleeping sister, her mind already working through plans for the cooperative, for the future, for the life they would build. And Eliza, despite her nightmares, slept deeply safely, knowing she was finally where she belonged. The hermit, the rebel, and the survivor. 3 people who should never have met, brought together by cruelty and commerce, transformed by courage and compassion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they rested in the certainty that whatever came, they would face it together. On Thunder Mountain, in a cabin that had sheltered loneliness for so long, love had found a way to bloom again. different from what had been lost, perhaps stronger for having been tested. Certainly more complex for encompassing multiple forms: romantic love, sisterly love, the love of found family. The snow continued to fall, covering the trails that led down to the valley, temporarily cutting them off from the world below. But for once, isolation felt like blessing rather than curse. They had everything they needed right here: shelter, warmth, and each other. And in the morning, when the sun broke through to reveal a world made new by snow, they would begin the work of building something that had never existed in this valley before, a community based on justice rather than exploitation, dignity rather than degradation, love rather than fear. But that was tomorrow's challenge. Tonight in a cabin on a mountain, three souls who'd found each other against all odds rested in the peace of belonging, of being home. The morning sun transformed the snow-covered valley into a glittering expanse of white so bright it hurt to look at directly. Elias stood on the cabin's porch, breathing in the sharp, clean air, while watching Mara and Eliza make their way carefully down the now treacherous trail. They were heading to the ranch for the first official meeting of the newly formed cooperative, and despite the snow, nothing could have kept them away. "Watch that rock?" Mara called back to her sister, who was managing remarkably well despite her still healing body. "It's slippery under the snow." Eliza navigated around it with careful precision, her face set with the same determination that had helped her survive 6 months in the mine quarters. "I'm fine, Mara. Stop mothering me." "Never," Mara replied with a smile that transformed her scarred face. They reached the valley floor where Thomas Morrison waited with a wagon, having promised to transport them to the ranch. Rosa Valdez was already in the wagon, her shoulder still bandaged, but her spirit undimmed. "The federal marshals have been busy," Rosa reported as they settled in for the ride. "They've arrested 3 more of Walsh's associates' men who knew about the murders and said nothing." "Good," Mara said firmly. "Silence in the face of evil is complicity." The ranch looked different under its blanket of snow, almost peaceful, as if nature was trying to cover the sins that had taken place there. But as they approached, Elias could see the burned ruins of the quarters stark black against the white, a reminder that some things couldn't be hidden. Inside Walsh's former house, now serving as the cooperative's headquarters, over 40 people had gathered. Former workers, townspeople who'd joined the cause, even some of Walsh's former customers who'd been horrified to learn the truth about their business partner. Judge Harrison sat at what had been Walsh's desk, Catherine beside him taking notes. "Before we begin," the judge said, calling the meeting to order, "I have news from Denver. The territorial governor has authorized emergency funds to help establish this cooperative. Additionally, several prominent businessmen shamed by their association with Walsh have offered to invest, asking only for fair return rather than control." A murmur of hope ran through the crowd. Real funding meant they could actually make this work, could transform Walsh's empire of exploitation into something beneficial for all. "We need leadership," Father Miguel said, standing to address the group. "People to make decisions, organize the work, represent us to buyers and banks." "I nominate Mara Keene," Rosa said immediately. She stood up when no one else would. "I'm not a rancher," Mara protested. "I don't know the first thing about cattle or crops." "But you know about fighting for people," Juan Valdez countered. "And we have plenty who know the practical side. What we need is someone we trust, someone who won't be corrupted by power." The vote was unanimous despite Mara's continued protests. Elias watched with pride as she finally accepted standing to address the group with that mixture of fierceness and vulnerability that had first caught his attention. "If I do this," she said, "I do it with conditions. Every major decision gets voted on by all members. Everyone who works shares in the profits, and we set aside funds to help other workers escape situations like ours." "The Underground Railroad for Indentured Servants," Catherine Harrison said with approval. "I like it." As the meeting progressed, organizing work teams and discussing immediate needs, Elias noticed Stokes being brought in under guard. The former foreman was scheduled to testify about Walsh's crimes, his freedom depending on his cooperation. "There's something else," Stokes said when given permission to speak. Walsh kept records, detailed records of every illegal deal, every bribe, every official he had in his pocket. He was paranoid about his associates betraying him, so he documented everything as insurance. "Where are these records?" Judge Harrison asked sharply. hidden in the mine. There's a sealed shaft supposedly too dangerous to enter. But it's not a real shaft, just a storage area Walsh created. Everything's in their documents gold he skimmed from investors, even photographs that could compromise half the territory's politicians. The judge immediately dispatched marshals to investigate, but Elias saw an opportunity. Your Honor, recovering those documents will be dangerous. The mine structure is unstable after years of neglect. You'll need someone who knows mountains, who understands rock and timber. You're volunteering? The judge asked. I am, but not alone. He looked at Mara. This is her fight as much as mine. It's too dangerous, Eliza protested. You just got each other. Don't risk it now. Some risks are worth taking, Mara said softly, touching her sister's cheek. And I need to see where you suffered. I need to understand what you survived. The group made their way to the mine entrance, a gaping wound in the hillside that seemed to exhale cold, stale air. The support beams were indeed rotting, and several had already collapsed, making the entrance a maze of fallen timber and loose rock. This is suicide, one of the marshals said flatly. We should dynamite it closed and forget whatever's in there. Those documents could free dozens of other workers, Mara argued, could expose corruption throughout the territory. We can't just abandon them. Elias studied the entrance with an experienced eye. It's doable, but we'll need to shore up supports as we go. And we'll need rope in case the floor gives way. They spent the next hour preparing gathering materials and equipment. Several former mine workers volunteered to help, their knowledge of the tunnels invaluable despite the trauma associated with the place. I worked this section, an older Mexican man named Carlos said, pointing to a hand-drawn map. The sealed shaft is maybe 100 feet in left side, but the tunnel narrows before you get there. Only one person can fit through at a time. As they prepared to enter, Father Miguel offered a blessing, and even those who weren't religious bowed their heads. The danger was real, and everyone knew it. Elias led the way, testing each footstep, examining every beam before trusting it with their weight. Mara followed, then 2 volunteers with the marshals waiting outside. The darkness was absolute beyond the first few feet, broken only by their lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the rough walls. This is where they kept you, Mara whispered, her voice carrying a weight of sorrow and rage. Not here, Carlos corrected from behind. Deeper. This is just the entrance. Gets worse as you go. They found the first body 30 feet in. A skeleton still in the remnants of work clothes, crushed under a collapsed beam. Carlos crossed himself. Martinez, he disappeared 2 years ago. Walsh said he ran off. Another murder to add to the count, Mara said grimly. They marked the location and continued the tunnel, indeed narrowing as Carlos had warned. Soon they were moving single-file shoulders, brushing the walls, the ceiling so low they had to crouch. There, Elias said, his lantern illuminating a crude wall of newer brick blocking a side passage. This has to be it. The brick was solid but not expertly laid. They worked carefully to remove enough bricks to squeeze through, aware that too much disturbance could bring the whole tunnel down on their heads. Beyond the wall was a small chamber carved from solid rock, much more stable than the mine tunnels. And filling the chamber were wooden crates, metal boxes, canvas bags heavy with contents. Mother of God, Carlos breathed. The first crate Elias opened contained gold coins, hundreds of them, each one skimmed from legitimate mine proceeds. The second held documents exactly as Stokes had described. Names, dates, amounts, crimes detailed with Walsh's meticulous handwriting. Look at this, Mara said, holding up a photograph. That's Senator Morrison from Denver, and that's a child. Elias took the photograph and immediately wished he hadn't. Walsh hadn't just documented financial crimes. He documented worse things, things that would destroy powerful men throughout the territory. We need to get all of this out, he said. Every document, every photograph. This is evidence of a conspiracy that goes far beyond one ranch. They formed a human chain, carefully passing boxes and crates through the narrow tunnel. It took hours, and twice they had to stop to shore up sections that threatened to collapse. By the time they emerged covered in dust and exhausted, the sun was setting. Judge Harrison's expression as he reviewed the materials evolved from shock to fury to determination. This changes everything, he said. This isn't just about labor exploitation. This is about murder, child abuse, corruption at the highest levels. What will you do? Mara asked. What I should have done years ago, the judge replied. Clean house, starting with Sheriff Brennan. The sheriff who'd been hovering at the edge of the group tried to run. He didn't get far. The federal marshals had him in custody within minutes, and a search of his office revealed his own cache of bribes from Walsh. That night, the cooperative held its first official dinner in what had been Walsh's dining room. The long table that had once hosted corrupt businessmen now seated former workers, their families, and allies from town. Father Miguel said grace, thanking God for deliverance and praying for wisdom in the challenges ahead. We need a new name for this place, Rosa suggested as they ate. It can't be the Walsh Ranch anymore. Something that honors those who died, Juan added. Maria Martinez, all the others. Liberation Ranch, Eliza suggested quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken up in the group, and everyone turned to look at her. Because that's what happened here. We were liberated. Liberation Ranch, Mara repeated, testing the words. I like it. The vote was unanimous. As the evening progressed, plans began to form. The cattle would need tending through winter. The burned quarters would be demolished and proper housing built. The mine after bodies were recovered and properly buried would be sealed forever. We'll need teachers, Catherine Harrison said. Many of the children have never been to school. I could do that, Eliza offered, then blushed at her own boldness. I mean, I love children and I can read and write well. You're 15 po, someone pointed out. Old enough to work in a mine, old enough to teach letters and numbers, Mara said firmly, defending her sister. Catherine smiled. I'll help you set up a curriculum. Education is the best weapon against exploitation. As the dinner wound down, Elias found himself outside needing air after the closeness of the mine and the crowded room. Mara joined him, slipping her hand into his. It's really happening, she said wonderingly. We're really building something new. Are you ready for this? He asked. Running a ranch cooperative, fighting corruption, raising your sister all while testifying in what will probably be the territory's biggest trial. I'm terrified, she admitted, but also exhilarated. For the first time in my life, I'm not just surviving or fighting against something. I'm building towards something. You know there will be resistance. Walsh had allies, powerful ones. They won't let this stand without a fight. She turned to face him, those remarkable eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Then we'll fight. But this time we won't be alone. A commotion from inside drew their attention. They returned to find one of the marshals had arrived with urgent news. 3 more ranches, he announced. Based on Walsh's documents, we've identified 3 more operations using illegal indenture contracts. The federal government is organizing raids for tomorrow. How can we help? Mara asked immediately. We need people who can talk to the workers, convince them it's safe to testify. Many are immigrants scared of authority. They need to see others who've been through it and survived. Without hesitation, a dozen former workers volunteered, including Rosa and Juan Carlos and others who'd found their courage. They would accompany the marshals, living proof that liberation was possible. I'm going too, Eliza said, standing despite her obvious exhaustion. You need to rest, Mara protested. Those workers need to see someone young who survived, Eliza countered with unexpected steel in her voice. They need to know children can make it through. Mara looked ready to argue further, but Elias touched her arm gently. She's right. And she's stronger than you think. You both are. The next morning, the Liberation Force departed in a convoy of wagons and riders. Mara kissed Elias goodbye at dawn, her lips warm against his in the cold morning air. Come back safe, he said. Come with us, she countered. We could use you. Someone needs to keep things running here. The cattle won't feed themselves and the new workers arriving need guidance. She smiled. Look at you becoming a rancher. Only for you, he replied, meaning it. The raids were successful beyond anyone's expectations. Not only were the 3 identified ranches shut down, but workers there provided information about others. Within a week, the federal investigation had expanded to encompass dozen operations across 3 territories. The trials began a month later. Mara testified for 3 straight days, her voice never wavering as she described the horrors she'd witnessed and experienced. Eliza testified too, her youth and innocence making her words even more powerful. When she described children as young as 8 working in the mines, Several jury members wept openly. Stokes testified as promised, revealing the full extent of the corruption network. His testimony implicated a senator, 2 judges, and numerous businessmen. By the time he finished, the prosecutor had enough evidence to pursue charges against 43 individuals. Through it all, Liberation Ranch continued to operate and grow. The cooperative model proved successful, with workers motivated by sharing in profits rather than fear of punishment. The cattle thrived under proper care, and the spring harvest promised to be the best in years. Elias divided his time between the ranch and the cabin, improving the trail as promised, and building the additions needed for their growing household. Mara had officially moved in with Eliza, though she spent as many nights at the cabin as at the ranch. One evening in late spring, as wildflowers began to bloom across the meadows, Elias found Mara sitting by the creek that ran past the cabin. She was reading a letter, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, concerned. She handed him the letter. It was from Catherine Harrison, writing from Washington, D.C., where she'd gone to lobby for federal legislation protecting workers' rights. "The bill passed," Mara whispered. "The Fair Labor Standards Act. It outlaws the kind of contracts Walsh used. Sets minimum wages, maximum hours, safety requirements. Everything we fought for." "Then why are you crying?" "Because it's named after Maria Valdez, the Maria Valdez Labor Protection Act. She didn't die for nothing, Elias. Her words, her journal changed the entire country." He sat beside her, pulling her close as she wept for the woman who'd documented horrors while living them, who'd died trying to escape, but whose testimony had freed thousands. "We should tell Rosa and Juan," he said when her tears had subsided. "Tomorrow. Tonight, I just want to sit here with you and watch the sunset and remember that sometimes good wins." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the mountains gold and pink. Below in the valley, Liberation Ranch bustled with activity as workers finished their day's labor and gathered for communal dinner. Smoke rose from chimneys of the new houses built where the quarters had stood proper homes with windows and insulation and dignity. "I've been thinking," Mara said eventually, "about the future." "What about it?" "The cooperative is established. The trials are almost over. Eliza is thriving as a teacher. The fight isn't over, but the crisis has passed." "Are you thinking of going to Denver? Catherine's offer still stands." Mara shook her head. "No, I'm thinking of something else entirely." She turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "I'm thinking about marrying the man who bought me for $35 and gave me freedom beyond price." Elias's heart stopped, then resumed at double speed. "Mara, unless you don't want—" He silenced her with a kiss that said everything words couldn't. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "Is that a yes?" she asked with a smile. "That's a yes to everything. Marriage, partnership, building a life together on this mountain and in that valley. Yes to all of it." "Good," she said, then added with characteristic practicality, "because I'm pregnant." This time Elias's heart did stop for a full second at least. "What? How, when?" She laughed, that full, rich sound he'd come to treasure. "I think you know how. As for when, about 2 months ago, near as I can figure, the night after the first trial verdict came in." "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We're having a baby. Are you happy?" He thought about the journey that had brought them here. A widower hiding on a mountain. A woman with a sack on her head on an auction block. A desperate rescue. An unlikely revolution, a love neither had expected. And now new life growing from the ashes of so much death. "I'm more than happy," he said. "I'm whole." They were married a week later in the mission, Father Miguel presiding over a ceremony that brought together the entire valley. Former workers, townspeople, even some of the federal officials who'd stayed to oversee the transition. Eliza stood as Mara's maid of honor, healthy and bright-eyed, bearing little resemblance to the broken girl they'd rescued from the mine quarters. Thomas Morrison gave Mara away, having become a father figure to both sisters. Judge Harrison and Catherine returned from Denver for the ceremony, bringing news that 3 more territories had passed similar labor protection laws. "You started something," Catherine told Mara at the reception. "Something that can't be stopped." "We all started it," Mara corrected. "Every person who stood up, who testified, who refused to be broken. I was just the spark. They were the fire." As the celebration continued into the night, Elias found himself standing with Juan Valdez, who'd become the ranch's operational manager, his practical knowledge invaluable despite his missing leg. "Never thought I'd see this day," Juan said, watching couples dance in what had been Walsh's parlor. "My sister would be so proud." "She is proud," Elias said firmly. "Wherever she is, she knows her words change the world." "You really believe that in an afterlife?" Elias thought about Margaret, about all the souls lost to Walsh's greed. "I believe love doesn't die. It transforms, continues in the lives it touched. Your sister's love for justice lives on in every worker who's free because of her testimony." Juan nodded, wiping at his eyes. "Rosa's pregnant too, you know. We're naming the baby Maria if it's a girl." "Mara's pregnant as well." Elias shared the word, still feeling wonderfully strange to say. "Look at us," Juan said with a wondering laugh. "Building families on the bones of a tyrant's empire. If that's not justice, I don't know what is." The autumn brought the baby a daughter with her mother's fierce eyes and her father's steady temperament. They named her Margaret Maria, honoring both past and present loss and liberation. Eliza proved a devoted aunt, often carrying the baby around the school. She'd established teaching her students that even the smallest person could change the world. The school had 40 students, now children, who would have been working in mines or fields, now learning to read and write and dream. Liberation Ranch flourished, becoming a model for cooperative farming throughout the territory. Delegations came from as far as California to study their methods, to understand how former slaves had become successful entrepreneurs. One winter evening, as snow again blanketed the valley, Elias and Mara sat in their expanded cabin, now a proper house, with rooms for family and frequent guests. Margaret Maria slept in her cradle while Eliza graded papers at the kitchen table. The fire crackled warmly, and the smell of bread baking filled the air. "Do you ever regret it?" Mara asked suddenly. "Giving up your solitude?" Elias looked around the room at the life they'd built, the love they'd cultivated, the hope they'd planted. "Solitude was never what I wanted. It was just all I thought I deserved. You showed me I was wrong." "You showed me I was stronger than I knew," she replied. "That being broken didn't mean being defeated." "We showed each other," he corrected, taking her hand. A knock at the door interrupted them. Eliza answered it to find Carlos, the former mine worker, now Liberation Ranch's mining consultant for their new safe copper operation. "Sorry to disturb," he said, "but there's news from Denver. They've arrested the last of the conspirators. The network is completely broken." "All of them?" Mara asked. "Every last one. Some are already making deals exposing other operations in other states. It's spreading like wildfire, this idea that workers are humans deserving of dignity." After Carlos left, they stood together on the porch, looking out at the valley transformed. Where once fear had ruled, community flourished. Where exploitation had thrived, cooperation bloomed. The mountain that had witnessed so much suffering now overlooked rehabilitation and renewal. "We did it," Mara said softly. "We really did it." "No," Elias corrected, pulling her close. "We started it. The next generation will finish it." He looked back through the window at Margaret Maria sleeping peacefully, at Eliza preparing lessons for tomorrow's students. "And they'll build something even better." As if in agreement, Margaret Maria stirred and made a small sound, not quite crying, more like announcing her presence in the world. Mara went to tend to her, and Elias watched his wife lift their daughter, the sight still capable of taking his breath away. The mountain man who'd hidden from humanity had become a husband, father, and pillar of a new community. The woman sold with the sack on her head had become a leader, mother, and symbol of resistance. The frightened girl in the mine quarters had become a teacher, shaping young minds toward justice. From the ashes of Walsh's evil empire had risen something unprecedented, a community owned by those who worked it profitable without exploitation, strong without cruelty. It wouldn't last forever, Elias knew. Nothing did. But it would last long enough to prove it was possible to inspire others to plant seeds that would grow long after they were gone. The snow continued to fall, covering the valley in its annual blanket of renewal. But inside the cabin, warmth prevailed, the warmth of family chosen and created, of purpose, discovered through adversity, of love that had survived everything thrown against it. Elias stood in the doorway between past and future, watching his wife nurse their daughter, while his sister-in-law prepared to educate the next generation. Behind him lay 3 years of solitude and grief. Ahead stretched unknown years of challenge and joy, struggle and triumph. He thought of that day at the auction when he'd spent everything he had on a woman whose face he couldn't see. The crowd had called him foolish. Walsh had called him crazy. But standing here now, surrounded by the life they'd built together, he knew the truth. Sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised in burlap sacks. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with chains. And sometimes, just sometimes, buying a rejected bride with a sack on her head turns out to be the best investment a man could ever make. The fire crackled its agreement. The snow whispered its blessing, and in her mother's arms, Margaret Maria opened eyes that were one brown, one green, a perfect blend of the fierce spirits who'd created her, a living symbol of the beauty that could rise from brokenness. Liberation Ranch slept peacefully in the valley below its residents, secure in homes they owned, earning wages they deserved, living lives they'd chosen. The mountain stood eternal guard, indifferent to human affairs, but sheltering those who respected its harsh truths. And in a cabin where loneliness had once reigned, love presided over a gathering of souls who'd found each other in the darkest of circumstances and chosen to build light together. The hermit and the rebel, the survivor and the teacher, the baby who would grow up free, all testament to the power of standing up, speaking out, and refusing to let evil have the last word. The story that had begun with cruelty and commerce had transformed into something neither Elias nor Mara could have imagined. Not just a love story, though it was certainly that. Not just a tale of justice, though justice had been served. It was proof that broken people could build beautiful things, that the rejected could become the cornerstone, that love could bloom in the harshest ground if given the chance. As the night deepened and the family settled into sleep, the mountains kept their silent vigil. They had witnessed the worst of humanity in Walsh's reign of terror. Now they witnessed the best people who'd suffered choosing to heal, who'd been broken, choosing to build, who'd been sold and bought, choosing to love freely. The last ember in the fireplace winked out, but the warmth remained. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose courage over fear, love over hate, community over isolation. But tonight in the cabin on Thunder Mountain, all was well. The mountain man had found his purpose. The woman with the sack had found her voice. The broken sister had found her strength. And together they'd found that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a better one. Spring would come again as it always did. The snow would melt, flowers would bloom, and new life would emerge from ground that had seemed dead. Liberation Ranch would prosper, its model spreading across the country. The Maria Valdez Labor Protection Act would save thousands from exploitation. But those were tomorrow's victories. Tonight's triumph was simpler and more profound. A family sleeping peacefully in a home built on love survivors who'd become thrivers. Proof that even the darkest chapter doesn't have to be the final one. The mountain stood witness to it all, eternal and unmoved. But perhaps if mountains could approve, they would nod their snow-capped peaks in satisfaction. For on their slopes, humans had proven what they were capable of when they chose love over fear, justice over comfort, community over isolation. And in a cabin where the ghost of loneliness had finally been exorcised, 3 souls who'd saved each other slept the sleep of the victorious, the grateful, and the free.